Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
A single day added on to my prison sentence meant the difference between a normal jail and the unending nightmare of Peabody prison. I was supposed to get 364 days. That was the deal. But the judge didn't like my attitude, whatever the hell that meant. So he made it 365. Boom. 1 year was the minimum for prison. My lawyer made a stink and a half, but it didn't do any good. It's not his fault. In fact, he's the one who's going to release this statement to the press or leak it online if the Guardian Corrections Group, GCG, tries to get an injunction on us. People have to know what happened at Peabody prison. I'm going to put it right out there, and I'll tell you that it was haunted. You think I'm joking, nuts, or lying, but you have no idea. Haunted prisons aren't anything like you imagine. Those places that advertise themselves and give people tours are sick jokes compared to the real thing. It got so bad that you can actually look up CGC's official filings for Chapter 11. That shit put them out of business on their very first prison. And right there on the briefs, using an early statute of North Dakota law from 1857 to file an insurance claim, it says, site of Peabody prison confirmed by governor's office and 2 notary publics witnessing in person to be afflicted by the supernatural such that continued business is impossible. It wasn't the first time the prison was closed for that reason either, but leeches kept buying it and reopening it, hoping to make a buck off the common man. And I was shoved into that hellhole without knowing the history even a single bit. Don't get me wrong, the building itself wasn't so bad, especially for something straight out of 1853. It was a big stone cube that was squat, heavy, and cramped, but way less sealed off than modern prisons. We could see a lot of the cells around us. There was only one main hallway per floor, and we were close enough to pass things between the bars and have some real human interaction. It could have been worse. There were 5 floors and capacity for 500 prisoners. When I first got there, I had a bunch of cellmates, and I heard that there were 2,000 guys locked up, and I believed it. But that soon changed. I didn't talk to anyone for the first 3 weeks. I'd never been to real prison before, and I was messed up over it. I didn't want to accept that I would be in that place and stuck with 3 other guys in my cell for an entire year. The whole prison seemed full of feral men. The bottom floor would start screaming and hollering and panicking in the middle of the night all at once. We were on the top floor, but we could hear the screams echoing through that open old layout like they were right there with us. I just thought the prisoners on the bottom floor were all nuts until the guards weren't there to wake us up the first day of my 4th week. When I woke up in my corner without some asshole guard banging on the bars of the cell, I finally had to talk. I asked one of my cellmates, Dante, what was going on, and I'll never forget the fear in his voice as he said something that should have made us all incredibly happy. The guards are all gone, man. The prisoners were talking quietly between the cells and loudly between the floors through various whispers and shouts. But the most we could figure out was that something on the first floor had made them all quit and protest. Sure, must have been the crazies screaming like that during the night, right? Except none of us could get any word from the bottom floor. It was dead silent down there. The guys in the second called out for hours. Someone was down there, they said, because They could hear shuffling footsteps walking around at random every so often, but whoever it was never said a single word. That was the first time Dante mentioned the crazy stories from the first floor. He muttered that he hoped none of that was true, but when I asked about it, he just shook his head. Nothing, man. None of it ever made sense. We were a little worried as the day wore on, and no one came to let us out for breakfast, and no one came to let us out for lunch. The time we usually got to spend outside in the yard came and went, and people began getting restless. In the cell to our left, Dante's friend, Will, began telling guys to pass the word that we should all calm down and start sharing any food we had holed away. I remember asking Dante, "Is it really that bad?" "Well, they've denied meals and yard time for a day or two before," he told me. But the other two guys in our cells didn't look convinced. One of them said, "But not like this. They made damn sure we knew what we did. They never just up and left." Someone handed us pieces of crusty old bread through the bars. It was much appreciated. The new guards didn't show up for work for another full day. We got plenty of yard time that day from these new guys, but they seemed more confused than us. We all watched from a distance as Will asked a guard about what had happened. The guard shrugged. "I don't know. GCG was paying a premium for fast hires, so I signed up." "What about the prisoners on the first floor?" Will asked. We could still hear him shuffling around down there. We looked on the way out to the yard, but we couldn't see anybody. "Huh?" The guard frowned. "Nobody in there. They all got transferred." "Transferred? The hell's that mean?" "It means DOCR took them back. Returned to state custody since the company couldn't handle them." Well, that made sense. If the floor had been full of nut jobs, then North Dakota's first local private prison company hardly had the experience to handle them. But these new guys didn't even have the skills to handle us. There were half as many guards as before, and they didn't know the routines or who the dangerous ones were among us. As a result, they were distant, scared, and forceful. All except one guy, Kellen. Kellen wasn't the first guard to treat us like human beings, but by then he was the only one around. He traded jokes while in the yard, never hit us, and looked us in the eyes when he talked. He went and found some paperwork to confirm the crazies had actually been transferred. But it took 3 months to get that info out of GCG. By the time he told us he'd heard back, we'd sort of forgotten the whole thing. 2 nights later, maybe 2 hours past lights out, the guys on the second floor began screaming. Dante leapt up and fell on one of our cellmates by accident before shouting, "Shit! Shit! Must be a fire!" And the guys in our row began banging on the bars and shouting for the guards, but the uniforms charged past and headed downstairs without talking to us. We could hear them shouting orders down below and then yelling in confusion. The prisoners' screams were clear, coming from the second, and it sounded like they were terrified of something in particular and wanted help. The sounds of gates being slammed and people running reached us after about 10 minutes shouting, and then it was silent, and we sat in the dark waiting and listening until morning. When the new shifts came in, they were surprised and confused, and Kellen came by to ask us what had happened. We told him what we knew, but he'd shown up and found open gates and an empty second floor. There was no indication what had happened, but he promised to check with corporate and figure out if the absent prisoners had all been rapidly transferred again. Dante gripped the bars and made sure Kellen was looking at him. "Please find out who the hell is walking around there at night." Kellen blinked at that. I'm day shift, so I don't know what I can do, but what do you mean?" "The prisoners are gone. Dante told him, fiercely but quietly. But the guys on the third floor said they still hear someone, maybe 2 or 3 someones, shuffling their feet every hour or so, till morning. I guess I could go look right now. Dante reached for the bars and grabbed his uniform, something which usually got us a beating. Hear me. Do not go in there by yourself. Stay in the stairwell unless someone's with you. Kellen nodded fearfully. It looked like he finally understood how spooked we were. He waved another guard off, and Dante let go. But nothing more came of it for a whole season. The night shift had quit, and more guards got hired at an even higher pay. Kellen and another uniform scooped out the first 2 floors, but they found nothing. Dante thought it was because they were looking during the day, but he wasn't about to ask our only friend to risk himself. It was maybe 3 months later. Yeah, I was halfway through my sentence, and I had taken up drawing, so I had a pen and paper, when we woke up in the middle of the night to everyone on the 3rd floor screaming in absolute panic. This time we were less scared during the event itself. Will offered a guard racing past $500 from his commissary account if the man would come back and tell them what was going on. Dante listened intently, trying to hear individual screams from the 3rd floor over everyone else's shouting and confusion. I wrote down any words he thought he heard. What I wrote down: Jesus Christ! Killing him! God! Let us out! Coming this way! We weren't as scared when it was happening because we'd lived through it twice before. But this time, the long-term fear was much deeper. Now we knew for sure what was going to happen again, and any prisoners that had the means began lawyering up and doing everything they could to transfer to other prisons, even if it meant worse conditions. The problem was the North Dakota prison system was already overflowing, which was the whole reason GCG got started in the first place. So every guy that got out meant it was that much harder for the rest of us. Both of our cellmates transferred, giving us more space, so that was nice. But it was small consolation. Apparently word had started to spread outside, and GCG's solution, instead of paying the guards even more, was to stop having the night shift at all, except for just one poor guy. Kellen was a bit miffed he hadn't gotten a raise out of the whole thing, but he was starting to believe us that something was going on. By then, he'd been around a while, and he knew we weren't bullshitters. And too many other prisoners had told him they'd heard someone walking around the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floors at random during the night. It was just a few steps, sometimes as many as 20, but it only happened every so often, and only once it had been long enough that you'd thought it had stopped for good. One guy on the 4th floor said he heard a full run from one end of the 3rd floor hallway to the other, clear enough that he'd expected the guard to come charging up the stairwell, but nobody had appeared. He slit his wrists and got transferred out on a medical leave the next day, so we took him serious. All that was enough to get Kellen to start doing some research on the outside. He came to us in the 7th month of my sentence with a pale face. Beside us at the bars, Will asked, "What's the word?" Kellen seemed grim. A lot of bullshit out there, but this place is mentioned a lot. It's been closed before, but I keep getting stonewalled when I ask for the historical documents. Thing is, I don't think the prison itself is the problem. Get this. He pulled out a notepad for reference. 2 Canadian priests, Fathers Norbert Provencher and Sévère Dumoulin, visited Pembina in 1818, before it was even an official township. That was when the Hudson Bay Company was big around these parts. That's how long ago it was. Pembina was the biggest town in North Dakota then, so the trading post was full, and and the priests chose to sleep outside by where the Pembina River meets the Red River. Folk tale has it that a vision of a rotting woman came in the night and stole Provencher's life. The two men bartered with her to split the remaining life between them, consigning both to live only 35 more years instead of 70 Sevier had left. Sevier got an extra month and 20 days as a gift from his friend for his sacrifice. He paused, as if we might guess the obvious outcome. They both died 35 years later. I knew Pembina Prison had a horrible problem, but that didn't mean I had to believe everything. Let me guess. A month and 20 days apart? Kellen nodded. Dante snorted. It's true, dude, Kellen insisted. The dates of death are right there on Wikipedia, but get this. 35 years after 1818 made their death year 1853, the year this prison was built. And the place they camped that night? By the meeting of the rivers? I didn't know what it meant, but I was beginning to feel very uneasy. It's right here, isn't it? He was dead serious. I think there's some shit here, ancient shit. I asked a guy I know, he's got Chippewa relatives, over at Turtle Mountain. They know the history of the Red River better than anyone else. He said his uncle told him to never sleep at the meeting of the Red River and the Pembina River. He said something lives there under the ground and awakens with the changing of the seasons. We were silent for a beat after that. It was folktale nonsense, but it was as good a theory as any. Whatever it was going to come back, and it wasn't friendly. Will talked to Kellen for another few minutes, but Dante was silent. After he was gone, I asked him, "What's wrong?" He sat on one of the now unused bunks and told me, "I got another 5 years in here, and I ain't got no money for a lawyer. Your sentence will be up before it reaches us, and I'll be here alone." Will it? There was no way to be sure. I'll be back in 2 months for the 4th floor, and then 3 months after that for us. I could get out a week before or a day too late. It doesn't seem to be exact. He just looked at the floor. What I mean is, I do hope you get out before it comes. Oh. I wasn't sure what else to say after that, so I just sat in my corner, like I always did. It wasn't too much after that we heard GCG was going under. The mad rush of transfers had pissed off the state and lost the company a vital contract for a second location, and investors had pulled out or something. The number of guards was cut, then slashed, and Kellen took a pay hit to stay on as the only guy on the day shift. There's only 2 prisoners left on the 4th floor, he told the 20 of us remaining, as the general week we expected it to happen approached. I feel like I should stay late just to see what the hell's going on down there. But the former guards I asked about it are all terrified as hell and refused to talk. Some got violent just because I asked. It's cool, Will told him. You got a kid at home. Don't be here for it. The 20 of us left on the 5th floor, sat in our cells once night fell, praying and listening. On Monday night, nothing happened. The 2 guys down below occasionally shouted up to us that everything was clear. On Tuesday night, nothing happened. The strain was growing, though, and we could hear him breathing rapidly down there. I could only imagine the adrenaline rushing through them every minute until dawn. On Wednesday night, nothing happened. Yet something had changed in the air. The prison was much quieter now than 2,000 men and had become 22, and I thought I could feel a subtle sort of heartbeat in the air, pounding against reality like it was a thin sheet of paper. It's just your imagination, Dante whispered. None of us were willing to speak louder than that. On Thursday night, the heartbeat became a feeling of footsteps approaching from a great distance. "Guys!" Will shouted from his cell. "You good down there?" "Still here," one responded from down below. "But I can feel it. It's at the door. It's knocking." What the hell's that supposed to mean? But the man below did not respond. Friday night. That was the night it would happen. All day the two guys on Fourth pulled and clanged on their bars, begging to be let out. Kellen was torn. After 2 hours of listening to that pleading, he came up with an idea and transferred both of them up to our floor. "If nobody's on 4," he said happily, "then we'll all be safe, right?" Out loud we agreed, but we were kidding ourselves. When the night guard showed up, he freaked and took the two men back down. He said out loud what we were all thinking. "If nobody's on 4, then it'll just come right to 5 and get us all." What the hell was Kellen thinking? We had to listen to hours of sobbing that evening. It was the hardest trial of my life. I wanted to call out to the night guard. I wanted to ask him to get those men out of there. But if I did, I knew whatever was coming would find all of us instead. The moment it happened was like a cold hand on my shoulder. "What's going on down there?" Dante shouted. The man, who was not sobbing, called back, It's changing." Will demanded, "What's happening? Tell us." "It's red." "Red? It's red." "What's red?" Will yelled insistently. "God damn it, what's red?" We stared down the hallway at the night guard, who stood listening with fear. The screaming began a few seconds later, this time only 1 floor below. We could clearly hear every word. The sobbing prisoner shrieked, "There! It's there!" The man who'd been communicating with us began incoherently, raging with fear against his bars. Then, strangely, he stopped. The 20 of us clung to our bars, unable to help, unable to flee. Many of us cried, but we were otherwise silent, for to yell would be to drown out the last words of the men below. But they were eerily quiet for nearly 2 hours. We waited in strained silence as random footsteps traversed the 4th floor every so often. What was happening? For the first time, the victims of whatever was going on down below had chosen to be quiet instead of yelling for help. Why would that make things different? At long last, the sobbing man broke the silence. "Oh my God, it's coming your way." "Shut up. It'll see you. Distracted. Hit your bars." The sound of clanging echoed up the stairwell. The sobbing man said with terror, "It knows. It knows. Jesus Christ, do something." We were no longer silent. We echoed that sentiment loudly and repeatedly to the guard. "Do something." He just stood there, literally quaking in his boots. Will screamed at him, "Snap out of it!" The other guards and prisoners got away. You can too. Whatever it is, it won't follow you if you let them out and leave. I shouted, "They're gonna die down there!" Dante threw his shoe, and the impact finally snapped the man out of his terror. The guard ran to the stairwell and descended. The first thing we heard him say was taken aback, "Mary, Mother of Christ." The sobbing man again, "Over here! For God's sakes, let us out!" The other prisoner wasn't talking for some reason. We could hear his terror, gasping, but that too went quiet. Then we heard a buzzer, and all the gates on 4 slammed loudly open. The sounds of panting, running, and someone dragging something followed. The prison went silent. And just like that, we were alone again. The formerly crowded prison now felt terrifyingly large and empty, with only 20 of us and no guards. That night, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from down below. I counted time as best I could. 40 minutes. Then someone took 3 steps out of his cell and into the hallway. An hour and 6 minutes. Someone ran 10 steps along the hallway and stopped abruptly. 28 minutes. The The footsteps approached the stairwell, but then turned into a cell and went silent. Thing was, whoever it was sounded barefoot, and the starting and stopping locations did not match. Where they ended was often nowhere near where they began again later. By the time dawn came, we were scared into motionless, terrified silence, and it took Helen's arrival for us to begin stirring again. With GCG in bankruptcy court, we no longer had a night guard at all. If it came for us, there'd be nobody to let us out of our cells, like everyone else. We hardly talked, we hardly ate. Each passing day was a grain of sand falling through an hourglass, marking our executions. Our fellows began confessing to crimes they hadn't even committed just to get transferred to Supermax out of state, the only option left. Well, that and suicide attempts. One by one, Kellen escorted or dragged out guys out of our floor. 20 became 15, then 10. Then it was just me and Dante, with Will still in the cell to our left. The three of us and Kellen, 4 men waiting for doom. We sat playing card games in the weeks leading up to it. It would be 1 full year for me in that place, but I could swear I'd spent a lifetime in that cell. I couldn't think, couldn't remember life before, couldn't imagine surviving after. Every day I prayed for a transfer to come in, but North Dakota got sick of our shit, and the judges had stopped hearing cases from Pembina Prison. They didn't know there were only 3 of us left. Nobody knew. We contacted the media. We phoned the governor's office. We made a ruckus. That was worse than nobody knowing. It turned out nobody cared. 2, there was nobody higher up at GCG following the situation, and Kellen couldn't get anybody on the phone. Payroll, meaning just his paycheck, was being handled by a third-party disbursement company that couldn't answer questions about ongoing proceedings. The week approached. On Monday night, nothing happened. We were like statues in our cells, alone, waiting for a sign of the executioner's approach. When dawn came, we sighed and began moving again. Dante asked, "You get out Friday?" I nodded. If things went like before, I'd be released the day of. As long as I left before sundown, I'd be all right. On Tuesday night, nothing happened. 2 for 2. Just one more day. I sat through that darkness until... No. The feeling of the prison had changed around us. A subtle heartbeat seemed to pulse against our faces and ears and eyes. It had come a day earlier in the week than the last time. That morning, Will patted my arm as we both leaned out the bars. "Sorry, man." Dante just shook his head angrily. I wasn't going to get out in time. On Wednesday night, the heartbeat became the sound of footsteps approaching from some unfathomable distance. I think I stood at the bars of our cell that entire day, fingers wrapped around the metal with force to match the tension in the air and in our minds. This couldn't happen. This wouldn't happen. My lawyer would walk in and tell me he'd gotten the judge's unfair edition of an extra day removed. One day. One goddamn day. Even if I'd spent the whole year in this prison, one day still meant life or death. Let me out! Let me the hell out, for God's sake! But nobody cared and nobody'd listen. I'd like to tell you that Kellen stayed late that night. I'd like to tell you that when the entire floor began to glow red, the hallway, the cells, the stone itself, as whatever ungodly abomination, in the earth began to wake up upon the changing of the season, as distant footsteps became a traveler at the door of our minds, I'd like to tell you that Kellen was there and hit the button and opened the gates and let us all out. I'd like to tell you that I didn't see anything, and that I'm not permanently a broken man. I didn't claw at the walls of my cell as it approached slowly, moving a few steps every 20 to 70 minutes. I'd like to tell you that all three of us were able to run away and escape that horror upon reality, with its rotting hands and blind eyes radiating crimson light as it searched for us at random. But I can't give you a satisfying end to this story. The disbursement company fired Kellen and changed the locks in the property. According to their paperwork, all the prisoners had been moved, and they thought he'd been getting paid for guarding an empty prison. They left us in there for 11 days before the error was found, which meant 11 nights with that thing. For 11 days we starved. For 11 nights we sat absolutely still, not daring to move or breathe or even look left or right. It knew where we were, generally. It stood right outside our cell for hours, and sometimes walked right through the bars and grasped at the beds around us, daring us to make even the slightest motion. When you've spent 6 hours staring into the blind crimson eyes of a rotting demon, unable to blink your eyes for fear it will hear the air your lashes move, when you've seen what it's seen, the worlds it's walked, reflected in hellish red, you'll understand. No one cares. I'd like to tell you that Kellen actually existed. I'd like to tell you we had a friend among the guards, and that it wasn't all that bad. I'd like to tell you I wasn't traumatized by the hell I went through being left to rot and left to die as nothing more than a number on some corporation's books. But no one cares.
Shorty Small, a man neither short nor small, entered the coffee shop, surveyed the patrons, and found who he sought. Homer LaCroix sat in a corner table munching on a beignet with a mug of coffee in his right hand. When he approached the table, he growled, "What's so damn important? You dragged me down here at 7 in the morning." Raising the sweet pastry, Homer said, "Have you tried one of their beignets?" "I just moved here. I didn't know the place existed. And what the hell is a beignet?" "You haven't experienced New Orleans until you tried one of these. Sit, I'll order you one." LaCroix searched the room and caught the eye of one of the cafe's waitresses. He pointed to his coffee and held up his pastry. He then nodded at Small. "Shouldn't be too long. I told her you'd be joining me." "Homer, you're in New Orleans now, Shorty. You've got to learn to relax. How is the move?" "Wonderful. If you enjoy realizing all your worldly possessions fit into the back of an SUV. Where are you staying?" "At the moment, Claire's." LaCroix tilted his head. "At the moment?" "That's what I said." The waitress set a mug of coffee and the beignet in front of Small and walked away without saying a word. Small took a bite and raised his eyebrows. LaCroix smiled. "Good, aren't they?" "First thing you've been right about this morning, so why the early meeting?" Fishing a folded piece of paper out of his jacket pocket, LaCroix laid it in front of the big man. "Ever see anything like this?" Taking the page, Small studied it as he wiped powdered sugar off his lips with a napkin. "It's a walking stick, so?" "What else do you see?" "It's an ornately carved cane with a handle resembling a cobra about to strike. Get to the point, Homer." The tall, lanky man withdrew another picture from his jacket pocket. "Recognize this guy?" Small nodded. "Who wouldn't? He's an action movie star. I've seen most of his films, although nothing lately." "Well, he won't be making any more." Raising his head from studying the photo, Small appraised LaCroix. "What's that supposed to mean?" "He's dead." "He's probably old, too." "Mid-60s. Healthy and negotiating a new movie. He died of a snake bite. King cobra venom, according to the autopsy." Small rolled his eyes. "Homer, there aren't any wild king cobras in Louisiana, or the United States for that matter. They're native to India. I'm aware of that. Studying the picture of the walking stick again and then the picture of the actor, Small shook his head slowly. Please don't tell me that Kane did it. LaCroix shrugged. It's New Orleans. That's not an answer. What did the police say? They're washing their hands of it. The detective I spoke to said it probably got loose from its owner, whoever that might be. The cops aren't concerned? No. Where'd the actor get the walking stick? That's what the tourism board wants you to find out. Thought they were going to pay for my move here. A slightly over 1-inch thick envelope appeared on the table. LaCroix scooted it across the surface toward Small. 30,000, 10 for your move, and 20 as a retaining fee. The envelope disappeared under the table. Where's the cane? Never found. Small's mouth twitched. Then how did they know he owned one? Receipt found in his apartment. Did someone let a snake loose in his place in order to steal the walking stick? LaCroix shrugged. That's what you're supposed to determine. With a slight shake of his head, Small stood. For $20,000, I'll look into it. He turned to walk out of the cafe but stopped. The pastry was good, thanks. Claire Honoré stood behind the cash wrap and smiled as Shorty Small walked through the front door of her newly remodeled jewelry, gemstones, and minerals shop located in the French Quarter. Hi, what did Homer want? After kissing her, he showed her the picture of the cane. Ever see one of these before? Her eyes widened as she took in the photo. What's wrong, Claire? Tell me you didn't buy one. I didn't. What's the matter? They're from India and are believed to be cursed. They? How many of these are there? Too many. That didn't answer my question. What do you know about these things? Claire grew quiet for a few moments. She pursed her lips. Let's close the shop and get some coffee next door. It's complicated. With a mug of coffee cradled in her hand and sitting in a far corner of the small cafe, Claire looked at Small and sighed. It all started with a man named David Allen. He was born in 1925 and learned to whittle as a young boy. After a heart attack in the 1960s, he got serious about changing his hobby into something more lucrative. He gave away his early canes to local people who couldn't afford to buy one. Then he started selling them. He was a kind-hearted, good man. Then in 1981, he and his wife went to Washington, D.C. to participate in the Festival of American Folklife sponsored by the Smithsonian. During his visit to the festival, a man named Edgar Lort became fascinated at the walking sticks produced by David. Lort returned to New Orleans and set up a shop specializing in hand-carved walking sticks. He bought many from David Allen, but most of the ones occupying his shop came from all over the world. After taking a sip of coffee, Small said, Let me guess, he imported a bunch of canes from India. Claire nodded. I was joking. She gave him a grim smile. I'm not. In fact, he brought in 8 canes, all of similar design. One of those walking sticks was the one in the picture you showed me. From where? Somewhere in India. He never would tell me the exact location. I need to talk to this Lort character. That will be difficult. Small smiled. Why? He died by snakebite just before New Year's Day in 2015. The Cobra canes were discovered locked in a gun safe. How do you know so much about them? A shrug became his answer. Claire? I met Edgar at a Chamber of Commerce function when I first took over the shop. He told me all about his searches for the oddest and more unique walking sticks. He was a strange fellow and just as odd-looking. Your friend Homer LaCroix reminds me a lot of him. Yeah, Homer is a strange-looking dude. What happened to Lort's store? To my knowledge, he was heavy in debt. His bank took possession of the shop after he died and liquidated the inventory. To who? No one knows. It was done in secret. One day all of his inventory was in the shop. The next day, the building was empty with a for lease sign on it. Huh. Shorty, please don't get mixed up with this. There is some serious evil surrounding those Cobra walking sticks. Claire, you know I don't believe in all that crap. What about my grandmother, the witch? Small shrugged. Can't explain it, but I'm sure there's a logical explanation. Yes, there is. She was a witch. After giving her a half grin, he continued. Who would know more about the inventory? I suspect the bank. Which one? Bank of Louisiana. The one on St. Charles? She nodded. I'll check with them today. Claire continued to stare at the coffee in her mug. Don't worry, Claire. Nothing's going to happen. She snapped her head up and glared at Small. You don't know that. You're getting involved with something that should be left alone. And for what? Your curiosity? No, for $20,000. The glare softened. Just be careful. Always. Bank of Louisiana Vice President Justin Woodward gestured to the seat in front of his desk. Please have a seat, Mr. Small. What can I do for you today? I'm looking into a matter for the tourism board. Ah, then how can I help you? Small pulled the picture of the Cobra walking stick out of his jacket pocket and laid it in front of the banker. Supposedly, there might have been as many as 8 Kanes like this one in Lort's inventory the night the bank seized his store after his death. The tourism board would like to know where they went. Placing half readers on his nose, Woodward picked up the picture and studied the Kane. I remember them. I was just starting with the bank back then, and one of my first assignments was taking inventory of his shop. Do you remember what happened to them? Let me think. He kept the picture in his hand as he grew silent. After a minute, he laid it down on the desktop and started typing on his computer keyboard. He then studied the screen. It seems we consigned the entire lot of inventory to an auction house in Dallas. He stared at the screen for a few more moments, frowned, and started typing again. Removing his glasses, he returned his attention to Small. There is no record of the Cobra walking sticks being transferred to the auction house. Which means? It means if I hadn't remembered them, this would never have been discovered. They may have been stolen. Does the bank have records of them being inventoried the night of the seizure? Woodward started typing on his keyboard again. He then ran his fingers down the screen as if checking a list. His fingers stopped halfway down and he frowned. Oh dear. Did you find them? Yes, they were checked in, but did not make it to the auction house. What happened in between is the question. That was over a decade ago, isn't it, Mr. Woodward? Yes, we may never know what happened. Small raised an eyebrow. Was the inventory appraised prior to being sent to the auction house? If it was, I wasn't told. Is this the first time a discrepancy has been discovered? As far as I know it is. I was transferred out of that department before the auction house took possession of the inventory. Can you recall who might have had access back then? No, sorry. Standing, Small offered his hand. Thank you for your time. Woodward mindlessly shook it but kept his attention on his computer screen. Parked behind the bank where Small figured the bank employees kept their cars, he waited. At precisely 4:35 p.m., Justin Woodward exited the back door of the bank. With a hurried pace and eyes glued to a new BMW X5, the man unlocked the door and slipped into the driver's seat. A minute later, Small observed the backlights flare, the luxury SUV backed out of its parking space and screeched out of the lot. Following the bank executive through the heavy afternoon traffic in New Orleans did not impose a problem for Small. Having followed numerous marks over the years allowed him to perfect his technique. The bank vice president did not hurry but seemed to hesitate at one corner. Just as the light turned to yellow, he sped through the intersection. Small did not panic. As soon as the light changed in his favor again, he increased his speed until he saw the BMW 5 cars ahead stopped at another light. With a slight smile, he settled in and continued to follow Woodward. After 40 minutes of negotiating the streets of the Big Easy, the BMW emerged onto West Interstate 10. Small kept back as the two vehicles traveled west out of the city. An hour and a half later, the BMW pulled into the parking lot of a warehouse on the outskirts of Baton Rouge. Driving past, he noted the name and pulled over a half-mile further on. Using his cell phone, he entered a Google search of the place. The results came back as a private warehouse owned by an LLC. An additional search of the Louisiana Secretary of State's office told Shorty Small the warehouse served as the headquarters for an organization dedicated to the preservation of Louisiana culture. With a smile growing the more he read, he put his Ford Escape in gear and headed back to New Orleans. The next day, after spending the morning chasing business names, aliases, and doing business as statements, Shorty Small knew more about the financial holdings of Bank of Louisiana Vice President Justin Woodward. While all of the entities he identified appeared legitimate, the former hitman smelled blood in the water, so to speak. Something was off. His next step would be to find out more about the walking sticks. At 4 p.m., a graduate student at Tulane University escorted Small to the office of Carmen Fowler, Ph.D. After introductions, the graduate student left and Dr. Fowler smiled. "What can I help you with, Mr. Small?" "For starters, call me Shorty." "Very well. Do you have a question about anthropology?" Removing the picture of the cobra walking stick, he laid it on top of the conference table where they sat. She raised an eyebrow as she picked up the photo. "Are you in possession of this artifact, Shorty?" "No, I've been asked to look into its importance." "I see." She studied the picture for a few moments, stood, and went to a bookshelf next to her desk. She bent over and removed a book from the shelf. Flipping through it, she then returned to the table. Placing the book so Small could see the page, she tapped on a picture. "If I'm not mistaken, it's the same object." With a nod, Small looked at the professor and then lifted the cover of the book. The author was Carmen Fowler. "Apparently, I am speaking to someone who knows what they're talking about." She leaned back and folded her arms. "Who's asking you to look into its importance?" "I'm an investigator for the tourism board." "Ah." With a smile, she reached for the book and flipped to another page. "In the beginning, there were 10 of them. Not identical, but similar in design. They were all handmade in northeastern India during World War II in a secluded village called Mayong. According to legend, when the Japanese tried to invade India, they sent an expeditionary force as far as the Brahmaputra River where the village is located. Not long afterwards, Japan withdrew and concentrated more on their Burma campaign. 8 Kanes are said to have survived the encounter with the Japanese." "Is there a connection with the Japanese withdrawing and the Kanes?" "Legend tells us 2 of the walking sticks were given as gifts to the Japanese generals. Both died under mysterious circumstances." "Let me guess, snake bites." The professor's smile disappeared. "Yes, and those 2 walking sticks were never found." "Do you believe these objects are cursed, Professor Fowler?" Her gaze went from her visitor's face to the picture in her book and then back at the retired hitman. "There are a lot of mysterious events over the course of human history, many of which are hard to explain, Shorty. The city of Mayong is nicknamed the Land of Black Magic. Whether that is true is hard to determine, but once the Japanese encountered the people of the city, they quickly withdrew from India and concentrated their efforts elsewhere. Those facts alone could lead one to speculate." "Speculate what, Professor?" "While the Japanese had difficulties with supply lines stretching into India during World War II, the Cobra walking sticks may have been one of the reasons for the Japanese finally abandoning their goals in India." The next morning, Shorty Small fell into step with Justin Woodward as he walked through the bank's parking lot. Glancing at his walking companion, the banker said, "I'm extremely busy today, Mr. Small." "That's okay. I just thought you'd appreciate an update on what the tourism board discussed last night at their meeting." "Why would I care?" "Your name came up several times." Woodward stopped and turned toward Small. "Why would my name come up?" "They might be under the impression you are the owner of a warehouse in Baton Rouge that supplied a particularly rare walking stick to a high-end men's wear boutique. The shop then sold it to a well-known actor. The actor died under mysterious circumstances. The banker's eyes widened suddenly, and then he frowned. Even if I knew what you were talking about, I don't see how it would involve me. It normally wouldn't, but you see, the walking stick was one of 7 Kanes seized by your bank that disappeared before they could be sent to an auction house in Dallas. Are you accusing me of stealing them, Mr. Small? No, I'm just an investigator. I report to the tourism board. Woodward stared at Small for several moments. I'm late. If you have something else to say, make an appointment. I'll be reporting to work now. As the banker turned and hurried toward the building's rear entrance, Small said, Don't be surprised if the tourism board spoke to the bank's president early this morning. This statement only made the man walk faster. The time approached 10 a.m. After getting a cup of coffee and waiting in his vehicle in the back of the parking lot, Small watched as Justin Woodward exited the bank, a white box in his arms and a scowl on his face. A bank security guard followed 5 paces behind. Once they were several yards past the entrance, the guard stopped following and watched the ex-vice president unlock his BMW. He immediately returned to the bank's interior. Starting the engine of his Ford, Small waited for the luxury SUV to pull out of the parking lot before he followed. Keeping track of Woodward did not create too many challenges for Small. The ex-banker stopped at a liquor store several blocks from his apartment. He spent less than 2 minutes in the store before coming out with a brown paper bag containing his purchase. The shape reminded Small of some of his own purchases in liquor stores over the years. When Woodward parked his BMW in the apartment's parking lot, he hurried to his door on the first floor. Small glanced at his wristwatch, smiled, and settled back to wait. At 12:23 p.m., a Domino's pizza delivery car parked in an empty slot next to the BMW. The driver pulled an insulated bag out of the back seat and hurried toward the apartment. Small exited his vehicle and rushed toward the now open apartment door. He approached the space from the side, and just before Woodward could shut it, Small pushed the entry open, shoving the banker backward. He stumbled and the pizza flew from his hands. It skidded across the living room floor, leaving cheese, pepperoni, and sauce smeared on the carpet. Woodward slurred his words. What the hell are you doing here? Get out! Small withdrew his Glock 19 from his waistband, pointed it at Woodward, and growled, Shut up. The prone man stared up at the larger man, his eyes bulging. What do you want? Where are the walking sticks you stole? Raising to a knee, Woodward shook his head. I don't know what you're talking about. He tried to stand, but Small swept his legs out from under him, and he fell back, hitting his head hard on the floor. Stay down. He paused and walked toward the kitchen. A breakfast bar separated the 2 spaces. There he found a bottle of Johnny Walker Red Scotch with a third of its contents missing. A crystal highball glass next to it held ice cubes and half a glass of the amber liquid. Small picked up the glass and sniffed. There appeared to be little or no water mixed with the liquor. A little early to be drinking this shit straight, isn't it, Justin? Raising to an elbow, the younger man directed his gaze toward the ex-hitman. Mind your own fucking business. You caused me to lose my job. Wrong assessment, Justin. I didn't steal the walking sticks and then wait almost 10 years before selling one to a retail store. That one's on you. Not the brightest strategy, I might add. Woodward did not respond to the comment. Where are the rest of them? What? Small shook his head and walked back to the man now leaning on one elbow. With a swift kick, Woodward's head once again struck the carpet. Not as hard this time, but he stayed down. Now, Mr. Ex-Banker, I will ask this one more time. Where are the remaining walking sticks? Staring at the ceiling, the man folded his arms. I really don't know. Jeez, you don't have all your oars in the water, do you, dumbass? Small now stood above Woodward's head and screwed a suppressor into the barrel of the Glock. He then pointed it at the man's forehead. My patience is waning, Justin. Want to answer my question? But you're a cop. Never said I was. The man squeezed his eyes shut. Oh, shit. Yeah, that's pretty much what you're in right now. Don't make it deeper. Tell me where the walking sticks are. We sold all of them. How much? Don't lie. 15,000 each. Small gave a small whistle. Damn, Woodward. No wonder you bought a BMW. Who'd you sell them to? I don't remember. Small pulled the slide back on the gun. Who? A collector who owns a plantation in Naugatush, about 250 miles from here. Naugatush? Where's that? Northwest of Lafayette. Rolling his eyes, Small gritted his teeth and snarled, Where the fuck is Lafayette? Woodward, his eyes still closed, moaned, West of Baton Rouge, follow I-49 out of Lafayette. What's the guy's name? The ex-banker told him. Small new apartments, like the one he stood in, were built on concrete slabs in swampy states like southern Louisiana, so he aimed the gun to the left of Woodward's head and pulled the trigger. The sound, no louder than dropping a book on a table, scared the man laying on the carpet. He screamed as pieces of the shattered bullet burned into his cheek. At the same time, the ex-hitman noticed a dark stain spreading at the ex-banker's crotch. It's hard to miss at this distance, Justin. Next time, I won't. The drive northwest took over 4 hours. When he arrived at the plantation, he drove by the entrance at a reduced speed. Numerous signs warned about trespassing with a reference to a local ordinance and the penalties associated with such a transgression. With the sun setting in the west, Small found a local hotel 2 miles from the palatial southern mansion. There he used his laptop to do as much research as possible about the owner. The plantation, known locally as the Barton House, possessed an interesting history dating back to its construction in 1832. Over the course of the next 20 years, the owner continued to buy more land and extend his cotton empire to over 6,000 acres. By the time the Civil War broke out in the eastern states, the Barton House cultivated one of the largest cotton harvests in the state of Louisiana. Over 200 enslaved persons toiled in the fields of this massive undertaking. The period after the war saw the plantation shrink in landmass, but not in importance to the local economy. Small discovered the current occupant could trace his ancestry back to the original owners of the land. He was not only rich, but it was old wealth, and he possessed a passion for old antiques and items associated with the mystical history of Louisiana. He also learned the man preferred to seclude himself within the plantation property and seldom ventured out. Plus, he rarely received guests or visitors. Shorty Small planned to intrude on the recluse's privacy a few minutes after midnight. During his years as a hitman, Small learned numerous techniques on how to detect alarms and intruder prevention measures. He found none on his nocturnal trek to the Barton House. A full moon provided sufficient light so as not to need his night vision goggles. From what he could see, the structure needed extensive maintenance and a heavy dose of TLC. He entered the house after finding a rear door unlocked. This gave him pause as he extracted his Glock from his shoulder holster and proceeded with additional care. The interior resembled the exterior with a serious need for a remodel. In each room he found scattered clutter, cabinet doors hanging by one hinge, the sour odor of human urine, and the sound of scurrying critters. To help him avoid stumbling over debris or animals, he extracted a small high-powered LED flashlight. Halfway to the front of the house, he detected the distinct smell of death. He emerged into an atrium near the front entrance. A male body sat on the floor, its back propped against a wall near the main door. The face appeared as if contorted in pain. The eyes were open and stared sightlessly at a point near the ceiling 2 floors above it. Small examined the body closer. As he swept the narrow beam of the flashlight over the man, he noticed 2 puncture wounds on his right hand near the joint between his thumb and index finger. The wounds were swollen, with purplish skin surrounding the puncture marks. He took a picture of the wound with his cell phone and exited the house through the front door. By noon the same day, he was back in New Orleans and showing the picture of the puncture wounds to Claire. "What do those look like to you?" She looked at the picture, frowned, and then led Small to the rear of her small jewelry and gem store. Looking at a bookshelf in her office, she extracted a book, leafed through it, stopped on a page, and handed the open volume to Small. "It looks like this made the wound." The picture she handed him was of an ornately decorated walking stick with an intricately carved snakehead. With a tight smile, Small rubbed the back of his neck. "Come on, Claire, we've discussed this before. You can't be serious." "Oh, but I am, Shorty." She took the book back and flipped through more pages. "There are multiple examples of similar incidents having occurred before, only the object in question was a spear, not a walking stick." She stopped on a page and handed the book back to Small. Once again, he turned his attention to the open page before him. "Damn." She only nodded. "Okay, let's say I'm leaning toward believing you. How do I fight these things?" "That would be beyond my knowledge. You would need to consult someone who practices hoodoo." "Hoodoo?" "Yes, voodoo is a religion. Hoodoo, on the other hand, is more concerned with folklore and mysticism. A hoodoo practitioner often sees hoodoo as a sort of personal power, using their knowledge of herbs, minerals, and animals. With this knowledge and power, a practitioner can assist someone in a variety of situations, including luck, love, evil, or any particular retaliation against an enemy." "Ah, geez, Claire, where am I going to find someone like that?" She handed him a business card. "This is the address of someone who might know more than I do." After studying the card, he looked up at her. "Madame Toussaint?" "You pronounce her last name as Toussaint." "Oh." "It is important you remember that. She gets upset if you pronounce it differently." "Then she needs to spell it like it sounds." "It's French, Shorty." "Whatever." An elderly woman opened the door of a small house on the edge of the French Quarter. Small said, "Madame Toussaint?" "Yes." "I'm Shorty Small. I called earlier for an appointment." Yes, Mr. Small. Come in." Walking into the small, cramped living room, Small felt a momentary sensory overload. Every possible empty spot along 3 walls were covered by tapestries swirling with deep purples, golds, and reds. Intricate hemp-colored macrame wall hangings hung from various hooks on the ceiling. Along the remaining wall, there stood a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf which held so many volumes the wood in the middle seemed to sag. In the center of the cluttered room sat an intricately carved wood floor table surrounded by colorful pillows and rugs. Madame Toussaint said, "Please sit and I will try to answer your questions." Small felt like a giant in a land of gnomes as he struggled to get comfortable on the floor. When his host settled across from him, he opened the book Claire gave him to the page with the picture of the walking stick. "What can you tell me about these, Madame Toussaint?" She took the book and placed half-readers, which hung by a lanyard around her neck, on her nose. After she studied the picture, she closed the book, looked up at Small, and handed it back to him. "Do you seek answers of what this is, or do you seek knowledge about their purpose?" "Purpose, Madame Toussaint." "These are not hoodoo, Mr. Small. They are far more sinister." "What are they used for?" "They are called assassin's canes. Have you ever heard of those, Mr. Small?" "Yes. Some have a hidden sword within the shaft. I've seen some that were hollow and used as a blowgun to fire poison darts. A few possessed a heavy grip made of lead and used as a bludgeon." "Very good. The one in the picture you showed me has the same purpose, to eliminate one's enemies." "How did the ones in the picture work?" Her eyes narrowed. "The ones you speak of are rare. I know of only a handful imported from India. They disappeared years ago." I know of 2 men who recently purchased similar ones and both died of a snake bite. One of her hands shot up to cover her mouth. Oh dear, where? One here in New Orleans and another in Natchitoches. There were rumors of 7. Do you know where the remaining 5 might be? Small shook his head. You are trying to find them for the tourism board, aren't you, Mr. Small? Trying not to show his surprise at how Madame Toussaint knew of his mission, he only nodded. These walking sticks are a danger to anyone who holds them by the grip. How? A small smile came to her lips. They are petrified king cobras, Mr. Small. Once someone claims them, they will revert to their original form and attack anyone holding the cane. Normally, the wound is fatal, as you have mentioned. You're kidding, right? No, Mr. Small, I am not. So you're saying don't touch them by the grip? Not if you want to live. Justin Woodward unlocked his apartment door and opened it. Before he could step in, a strong hand in the middle of his back pushed him. He stumbled and fell forward, his nose making direct contact with the living room floor. Blood gushed as he screamed. What the hell? Shorty Small closed and locked the front door, making sure the deadbolt was fully engaged. He waited, his Glock now pointed at the prone, bleeding man. When the ex-banker looked up, he screamed, You! I'm gonna sue you for assault! You're a dangerous man! Small gave the man a slight smile. You have no idea. Now where are the remaining Cobra walking sticks? I told you, we sold them to a collector in Natchitoches. He's dead. Death by snake bite. Woodward's eyes widened. How? You obviously didn't know what you had, did you, Justin? What do you mean? Those walking sticks were originally from a village in India. From what I've been able to discover, they are petrified king cobras and designed to be assassin's canes, lethal to anyone who possesses them. Now, want to tell me where they are, or do you want to be charged with murder of 2 men, one of which was a famous actor? Woodward stood and went to the kitchen and found a towel to press against his still bleeding nose. You fucking broke my nose. I sue you. Justin, here's a little advice for you. Shut up. I will not shut up. This is the second time you've assaulted me. I have you locked up and the key thrown away. Small sighed and started screwing the suppressor into the barrel of his Glock. I'm going to tell you a little bit of my history and maybe, just maybe, you'll shut up. He pulled the slide back, charging the weapon. I'm not from New Orleans, asshole. I'm from Chicago. I made my living for a long time, solving personnel problems for rich and powerful men. My solutions were permanent. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The ex-banker's eyes grew wide as he finally understood who Shorty Small was. You're a hitman? I hate that word, but so your feeble mind can actually grasp your situation? Yes. Shit. There you go again. Are you finally figuring out how deep you are in it? A slow nod came from the man with the bleeding nose. Now, Justin, want to tell me where the remaining 5 walking sticks are? I wish I knew. What does that mean? Woodward removed the towel from his face. Blood still dripped. He rinsed the towel and then pressed it once again on his now crooked nose. It means we sold them on eBay. You have records of where you shipped them to, don't you? The man shrugged. Small pointed the suppressed Glock in Woodward's direction and pulled the trigger. The bullet missed the banker's ear by several inches and slammed into the refrigerator. You probably won't get your deposit back now. Are you crazy? Maybe, but I'm the person with a gun pointed at you. Raising the palm of his unused hand towards Small, Woodward took a deep breath through his mouth. Don't. I tell you. Good. I'm getting tired of your constant lying. They were shipped out of state to a collector in Texas. Why do I not believe you? I'm not lying. Where in Texas? Woodward hesitated for a second before saying, Houston. The Glock spat again, this time nicking the ex-banker's left ear. Now blood dripped from both his nose and ear running down his face. The gasp he emitted sounded more animal than human. Okay, just don't shoot again. Small growled, Last chance, Justin. Where are they? Storage unit near Lake Buncher train on the east side of the airport. Address? The banker gave him the address and unit number. Just before Small opened the apartment door, he turned. If you're lying or remove the Kanes before I get there, it will be the last thing you ever do, Justin. Capiche? The banker slowly nodded his head. Homer LaCroix met Small in the same coffee shop they always used for meetings. The big man arrived first and watched the lanky man enter the shop. When he sat down, he gave the ex-hitman a smile. So, you found the walking sticks? Yeah, they're in a storage unit near the airport. I cut the old lock off with a bolt cutter and put a new one on. He handed LaCroix a key. This opens the lock. The tall man did not reach for the offered item. Did you make sure they were there? Small nodded. Why didn't you just take them? With a half smile, the larger man said, You asked me to find them. I found them. You didn't say anything about taking them somewhere. Well, the tourism board wants them delivered to this address. He slid a business card across the table. Small looked at it but did not pick it up. Apparently, you and the tourism board don't understand what these canes are for, do you? LaCroix frowned. The old canes are worth a lot of money. The board wants to sell them and recuperate for expenses incurred. In other words, the board hasn't a clue what they are. Okay, Shorty. They know they are old and valuable. Other than that, what's so special about them? Homer, I might have been born at night, but it wasn't last night. The board is spending way too much money on getting these things back just because they are old and supposedly valuable. Which they aren't. Want to try again? After drumming his fingers on the table where they sat, LaCroix gave Small a half smile. I told him you were a smart guy. They know exactly what they are and how they work. They are, let's say, individuals who oppose the current members of the board. Our employer wants to offer each one of these individuals one of the canes as a peace offering. Small threw his head back and laughed out loud. He then grew serious and looked LaCroix in the eyes. So, they want me to deliver them. Is that what I'm hearing? A nod was his answer. No fucking way. Small stood and tossed the key to the storage unit at LaCroix. Guess you guys need to find another patsy. As the big man made a step toward the coffee shop door, LaCroix said, $50K in cash if you deliver the canes to the address on a card. The ex-hitman froze and turned back to the tall, lanking man. $50K? Another nod. When? As soon as possible. Not that when. When do I get paid? A thick white envelope appeared out of LaCroix's jacket and he placed it on the surface in front of him. Small returned to his chair and the envelope disappeared under the table. When do they want the canes delivered? No later than midnight tonight. Remembering something Madame Toussaint mentioned, he said, I'll figure out a way. When he arrived at the storage unit, the lock he placed there earlier no longer remained. He raised the door and found the entire unit empty. Returning to his SUV, he drove straight to Woodward's apartment. The BMW owned by the ex-banker was nowhere to be seen. Parking his vehicle, Small walked to the front door of the man's apartment and used a small tool from his wallet to pick the flimsy lock. Inside, he withdrew his Glock and searched all of the rooms. No one at home. A laptop occupied a desk in one of the spare bedrooms. Small touched the spacebar and the screen brightened. As he looked closer, an email program revealed the last message opened. The ex-hitman read it, smiled, and returned to his car, leaving the door to the apartment unlocked and slightly ajar. The drive to Baton Rouge took an hour and a half. The sun, low in the sky, would set soon, and dusk would aid him in the next task. Once he pulled into the parking lot of the warehouse owned by Woodward, he saw the BMW X5 parked next to a door. No other vehicles occupied the parking area. Before exiting his Ford Escape, he screwed the suppressor into the Glock. Checking to make sure the gun was charged, he exited, walked quickly to the door where the BMW was parked, and tried the knob. When it turned in his hand, he shook his head slowly and entered. Woodward stood hunched over a wooden crate on a workbench 15 yards from the entrance. He looked up as Small entered the room. His eyes locked on the Glock pointed at him. "Not you again?" "I thought I told you to leave those things where they were." "You have no idea how valuable they are, Small, and they aren't yours. Get out." Moving toward the middle of the space, Small kept the Glock pointed at Woodward. "Stand aside, Justin. You might actually get out of here alive." With a swift move not expected by the big man, the ex-banker reached into the wood crate and tossed an object toward Small. Stepping aside, the walking stick passed him on the right and fell to the concrete floor with a clatter. As Woodward threw another cane toward him, Small pulled the trigger on the Glock. His aim being true, snapped the shaft in two, and the pieces fell to the floor. Woodward screamed as one of the last canes in the wooden box came alive. The snake raised its head above the crate and hissed at Woodward. Frozen by surprise, the ex-banker stood mesmerized by the serpent's swaying head. It then hissed and struck out toward the man's hand, which still hovered unmoved above the container. Small watched as the snake clamped its fangs into the joint of the man's hand between the index finger and the thumb. Woodward looked on with horror as the snake released his hand and seemed to leap toward the man's head. As the cobra sunk its teeth into the soft tissue of his neck, Woodward's eyes rolled upward out of view and he fell to the concrete floor. The snake stiffened and dissolved into a white and gray powder as Shorty Small looked on. He walked over to the crate and looked in. One last walking stick remained. He then gathered the one he shot into and placed the pieces in the crate, being careful to avoid the grip of the cane. He then retrieved the one thrown at him. Holding it by the tip of the shaft, he also placed it in the crate. Using a hammer and nails already on the workbench, he placed the lid on the container and secured it. He then carried the closed box to his SUV. Before he left the parking lot, he locked the door of the warehouse and made sure it was closed. At 5 minutes to midnight, he delivered the crate with the remaining walking sticks to the address given to him by LaCroix. 2 days later, LaCroix waited at their usual table at the coffee shop, sipping his beverage as Small walked through the door. As the big man sat, LaCroix said, "What happened?" "I delivered the walking sticks before midnight." "Yes, I was told. There were only 3 and one was broken." Small's mouth twitched. "I used one to protect myself." The lanky man nodded. "Once again, the tourism board is pleased with your work. The banker who stole them can't be located. They want to have him placed under arrest." "No need. Where do you think the missing walking stick went? He won't be stealing anything again." LaCroix sipped his coffee and smiled.
I saw it, that first time, from the upstairs window. It is strange how moments become frozen in your mind. Single frames become clear. That evening encapsulated the feeling, first time I saw it from the upstairs window. I don't know how to explain it. Not in any way that'll make sense to you. I'm sorry. But I can tell you the truth about what happened. Not just the first time, no. If I could go back in time and change one event in my life, I would not have gone upstairs. I would not have been curious as to a flicker of motion. There is zero chance I would have looked out and seen what I saw. The chain of strange occurrences that followed would never have taken place. Things would go back to normal. I wonder sometimes, if I pray hard enough, will God hear me? Will he rewind the tape? No, God did not build us in its image. Instead, God made us the perfect prey. I'm getting ahead of myself, or behind. There isn't a lot of time. Events are escalating now. If you find this recording, it needs to be taken to the President or Congress or someone. You'll understand why, maybe not what or how, but why will be crystal clear. I am not insane. My name is Luke Harden. I moved to this town a little over 3 months ago. I fear this is my last will and testament. No, I know it will be. But never give up hope, right? My grandmother was originally from here, from Ottawa, Illinois. We would visit for the holidays every other year. As a child, I quite enjoyed seeing snow on the ground for Christmas, having grown up in Dallas. That was a single-day rarity once a decade. The entire city shut down, panic at the grocery store as everyone needed 10 loaves of bread and all the toilet paper. In Ottawa, it was just another day. My father would wake me up early and we would go down the block shoveling steps and sidewalks for the elderly residents. Snowball fights and cousins that laughed at the way I said y'all. It was idyllic, a Rockwell painting in my mind. So, when my aunt passed away and no one else wanted the house, I jumped on it. I was tired of the heat and the traffic and happily traded millions of angry people for 20,000 somewhat friendlier folks. Sure, the amenities were different, but different can be good. It didn't hurt. I seem to remember there were a lot of cute girls there as well. I had grown tired of the beautiful but unapproachable Dallas crowd. A Midwestern girl with a sweet smile a mile wide sounded perfect. I never got a chance to find out if that was true or not. The first time I saw it out the upstairs window was in late May. I'd already traded mid-90s temperatures for 60s and 70s. The old house didn't even have central air, just a furnace and old iron radiators and box fans for the windows. I hadn't unpacked everything, hardly anything really. The clothes in the dresser and closet were about the extent. My aunt's things, which were mostly my grandmother's things, were still everywhere. It was less unpacking than swapping places. I set the typewriter on the table and my recording equipment and computer in one of the smaller bedrooms upstairs. The house was old. It looked like a dollhouse or straight off a plantation maybe. When I was a kid, I swore it had a face. 4 bedrooms in the large second floor and one in the lower where my wheelchair-bound grandmother had slept. It was going to be the game room with a snooker table and dartboard if I ever figured out how to get the hospital bed out and remove the overwhelming 70s vibe. There was a lot to be done, but I thought I had plenty of time. That evening, I would learn differently. I had a pizza from Sam's, recommended by the cute lady at the bank who was smitten by my drawl. I didn't have the heart to tell her that mine was tame compared to the country boys in Wolfe County or Winsboro. She said the first thing I needed was a large pizza from Sam's, then gave me her number and hinted at what the second thing could be. She was right about the first. I had a piece, then 5 or 6 more. They cut the pizza in rows, not slices, and I found the middle pieces were thick with cheese and the thin crust beneath was sauced perfectly in my mouth as I climbed the stairs. 2 more, 7 and 8, one in my hand, the other in my mouth, and my phone in the other as I hit send on a text to my friend Alvin back home. It was then that I heard something. It sounded, at first, like tinnitus after a loud concert, a high-pitched ringing, pervasive and sustained. I nearly dropped my phone as I flinched back from it. The sound, miserable as it was, only made me pause at the top of the stairs and squint my eyes when a brilliant flash of lavender made me look towards the window. I felt the slice of pizza in my mouth begin to droop as I clenched harder than I had meant from the sudden stab of pain and then shock at the vividness of the soft purple flash. If it had been yellow, red, green even, I doubt my curiosity would have been piqued. but that lilac blossom color kindled a memory of summer spent downstairs as the scent of the flowers filled the entire house and tugged me forward. There was something, a shape the color of the late evening sky shadow, black against the black of the night, sliding sinuously against the roof of a car parked on the street a couple houses down. I blinked, confused at what I was sure I wasn't really seeing. Rationally, I speculated it was just a wet spot, oil perhaps, while the streetlight through the branches and leaves performed an optical illusion of some sort. I looked up and saw clear skies, still amazed at the sheer number of stars I could see after so long in the light pollution of Dallas-Fort Worth, then back to the stain of darkness. A dull yellow light as the driver's side door opened off the car with a mercurial ebony pool grabbed my attention. I saw the pool react, and at first I thought it was from the springs shifting as the heavy-set man got painfully out. Then I realized whatever it was that was on the car, it was not rainwater nor oil. The inky pool began to draw itself up. A cobra flare in its neck sped through my mind. Without time for a single thought, I slammed the hand holding the pizza against the window to alert him of the impending danger. Instead of a loud knock on the glass, a low slap and smash fell flaccid in the hallway, only for me. This may be the only reason I've lasted this long. The dark spot swept forward and over the man, showering him in what seemed to be a viscous, oily night, dropped down from space or separated from the void. I stared, smashed pizza pressed against the window as it slowly, absorbed into, for lack of a better term, his skin. He fell bonelessly to the sidewalk and convulsed as I watched, horrified. I dropped the pizza and hit 911. Or tried. My finger slid across a greasy piece of pepperoni that had fallen during my frantic smashing. I looked around in a panic and then slid the phone across my basketball shorts. I paused. The man stopped shaking and then, to my surprise, stood up slowly. I don't know why, but I stepped back quickly. Something primal in me shouted when I saw his head turn towards me. Had I just seen what I thought I saw? Did I eat too much pizza? I had, on both accounts. One would affect me more immediately when I woke the next morning. The other would become my personal hell. Keeping in the shadows and sticking my phone in my pocket, I crept back to the window. The man was nowhere to be seen. All that remained was tomato sauce smeared on the window and my heart hammering in my ears. You would think I could have chalked it up to indigestion and being overly tired and stressed from the move. Both options seemed valid, and I clung to them tightly at first. In fact, I went on as if nothing happened after the first time I saw it from the upstairs window. I laughed about it as I scrubbed the window the next morning. The neighborhood was quiet, and I watched crimson and blue streaks in the trees and bushes below, the cardinals and jays out early and full of manic energy. I decided to go to the local bookstore and get a book on birds. As I happily scrubbed the stubborn grease and decided on the day's excursion, I froze as the heavy-set man came out of his house. He looked angry, and I couldn't tell if he was limping or just had an unwieldy gait. No matter, though, as he looked up and our eyes locked, the paper towel fell from my hand to the floor, and my heart momentarily stopped. He smiled and waved up at me. Instinctively, I smiled, big and fake, and waved back. I bent over to grab the paper towel, and when I looked again, he was pulling away. I laughed at my own stupidity and finished cleaning the grease and sauce off the pane of glass. Lavender flashes and ink blots were forgotten as I watched a sparrow argue with a crow. It was easy to forget things at the moment as I stared at the sparrow and the crow, realizing they were after the same thing, some scrap I couldn't make out from the second-story window. It seemed playful, almost cartoonish, as the little puff of feathers tried to imitate the larger crow. The crow tore the sparrow to shreds for its insolence, and then the rest of the murderer crows came down to feast on the scraps. I felt sick. It all happened so quickly. But then it was done. I shook myself from my stupor, frightened at the fury of nature, and made my way downstairs to the garage. I'd bought a bicycle specifically for bringing along on the move. The town is small and has plenty of sidewalks and not much traffic, so it seemed healthier. Maybe one of those mythical Midwest girls would appreciate my smaller carbon footprint, or at least my toned calf muscles. I was never all that picky. Not that it mattered. Not that anything matters. Humans have this big misconception they're something other than an accident. I firmly believed we had meaning, simply due to our place of dominance on the planet. I just didn't think it was so low on the food chain. Not sparrow versus crow low, but far from the top. It was a beautiful day, 70-something, sunny. Felt good to pump the pedals and feel the wind blow across my face. The bookstore was downtown, by the park and the coffee shop. Though the park is barely anything but an open lot, one block of grass with a few trees, a fountain, and with a rock with a brass plate on it to commemorate Lincoln and Douglas debating years and years ago. It was noon and still relatively quiet. The standard lunch rush crowd headed to the fast food joints, and a few people lazily enjoying the day. I took an extra lap around the heart of town, the old court building, an inordinate number of bars and churches, and really not much else. I liked it. You could feel time stretch a little as the hustle and bustle of the big city fell to the wayside. I had the bookstore to myself, except for the cashier that doubled as co-owner.
Good to see you again, Luke. How can we help you today?
She asked pleasantly. I could not remember her name to save my life, though she had been a fixture since my teenage years. Would it have saved my life? The one so near its end? Would that errant butterfly flapping its wings in Nepal send a wave through the cosmos that would negate what was to come, if I could have simply remembered her name? No. Looking for a book on birds, ma'am, I replied cordially, my southern manners kicking in. She giggled. I told myself it was at the ma'am and not the accent.
Local or general?
Local, if you don't mind. She giggled again, and I felt my face flush. She laughed at me the way I laughed at someone from the sticks.
I just got this one in, and lucky for you, I ordered 2 copies. Plan on taking a copy out to Starved Rock this weekend.
I took the copy and looked at the spine. Ornithological Wonders of the Illinois Valley by L. Gabehart. I thumbed through and was immediately stricken by the watercolors inside. I will take it.
Anything else?
The whole settling into small-town life was a big change for me. I was used to a certain pace that was non-existent here. As much as riding my bike and hiking the trails was fun, I needed some kind of mental stimulant. What do you recommend? I tend to read strange Eastern European absurdists.
Kafka, Karms?
She asked. Yes, Kirshanovsky as well, I answered happily. She was my kind of person.
You ever read Stanislaw Lem? Absurd and hilarious, the Chichi trilogy might do the trick.
She said as she looked about the store. I smiled and nodded. That sounds great. Any good horror? She brightened up at that question.
Yes, a local author. He did the exact opposite of you, as a matter of fact. I want to say he lives in Grand Prairie now, says it's the home of Sandy Cheeks from SpongeBob.
I nodded and let out a little laugh. And Selena Gomez from Disney. I know Grand Prairie well.
I think we still have an autographed copy or two up front. Amethyst Light by Jiry,
she said, turning to look behind the counter. I felt my blood turn cold. Did you say amethyst?
Indeed. His favorite color. He said it here in town. Half the girls in town claim to be the basis for the love interest.
She said, not hearing the panic in my voice. Coincidence. Nothing more. I could see the amethyst lights clearly, along with the black ooze as it attacked that man. I'll take it. Thank you kindly, I decided. I barely heard her giggle over the thunder of my pulse in my head. How odd. A book named after a delusion written by an author that fled to where I had moved from. These thoughts tore at my mind as I absently paid for the books and began pedaling back towards home. I could not shake a strange foreboding, as it seemed to well up with every rotation of the pedals. Beep! I squeezed the brake and nearly fell over the handlebars. I looked around in confusion and saw I had run a red light. I turned to apologize to the driver, and my heart climbed into my throat. It was my heavy-set neighbor in his blue sedan. I scooted back off the street and onto the sidewalk and tried to look less scared to death and somewhat apologetic. He nodded at me as he passed, strangely expressionless. He continued to stare, turning his head, and I swear I saw a lavender flash across his dead brown eyes. It was early yet, but the shadows seemed to grow long as terror gripped tight to my soul. The day that had felt so perfect now carried a chill that swept down my spine, frozen lightning that danced down the microbeats of sweat on my back and set my teeth to chatter. I crossed the little bridge that led to the high school and my new home. The waters of the Fox River seemed to churn hungrily in gray shades of avarice, and I saw an old man on a boat rocking as he held a rod. He looked up and waved at me, and I waved back with a smile that eased the panic for a second. Not everyone had an ink blot absorbed into their body. Yet. Not that I was aware of, at least.
Hey!
A voice called out. I turned and looked at the gravel parking lot across from the high school, where a guy stood next to a Camaro that had seen its better days. I slowed down and looked at him in confused wonder. He had the most magnificent mullet I had ever seen. It was dark brown, nearly black, with scraggly white hairs that defied physics, parted in the center and nearly professional on top, but over his collar splashed the Kentucky waterfall of every early 90s action hero.
Yeah, you! Luke, right?
He yelled. I stopped enjoying the mullet as I hit the brakes. Instant, nearly overwhelming anxiety burst through me. My pupils became pinpoints, and a sheen of icy sweat blossomed over my skin. I apologize, but we don't know each other, far as I reckon.
We do not. I got an alert that someone bought a copy of my book. I called the book mouse, and Brenda said it was you.
He answered. And you Googled me? Found my address and casually waited here for me to pass by? That's kind of fucking creepy, Mr. Gabehart, I heard myself say without thinking.
When you put it that way, I guess it is. But I can't say it isn't accurate. It's Lynn, by the way. Mr. Gabehart is my dad.
Mr. Gabehart said. Speaks unwell of Brenda at the Book Mouse as well. Now, I will do my best to excuse this as small-town Americana, but I don't believe this should be in the brochure for Midwestern life. How can I help you, Mr. Gabehart? I asked.
Please, it's Lynn. I apologize, but that is the first copy of my book to be sold. I got a little excited and a lot creepy.
Lynn admitted, his cheeks flared a bright red. A lot fucking creepy. Congratulations. What I thumbed through was lovely. He smiled so big that his salt and pepper goatee turned into a pickle shape. I decided he was Lynn. Then I saw the pen he had in his hand. Now, I don't have a pen, but it would be an honor to get this thing signed.
I have a pen,
he proclaimed. No shit. Well then, if you'd do me the honor. I pedaled into the parking lot and pulled out the books from my backpack and handed him the Ornithological Wonders of Illinois Valley. It's funny to think it took reaching the end to find a new best friend, or that he would be stuck in 1988. It's hard to go back the scant weeks, when my main image of him is now of him lying in a swill of black as purple lights flash in the air around him. No. Later. He handed me the book back, and it said in an almost illegible scratch,
To Luke, I only stalk birds, mostly. Sorry. Thank you, Lynn.
I appreciate that. And congratulations on getting a book out there. It must be difficult, I said, unsure of what to say. Lynn laughed.
I get high and paint birds. It took longer to remember my Amazon password than it did to submit. It's a crazy world. So, you like amethyst lights?
What?
The book. I used to party with Gear back in the day. Used to get shitty and sing karaoke. He helped me to figure out publishing.
He paused and looked at me, slightly ashamed.
Brenda told me you bought it.
I don't know if there's such a thing as fate or predestination, but I suddenly wondered at the likelihood of it all. The sheer coincidence of seeing what I had seen, to find in the book, to meeting Lynn, who just happened to know the author of the book. If this were a horror movie or book, I would yell at the screen for the hero to leave town immediately. But I'm not that smart. Or hindsight is 20/20. Or rose-colored? I don't know. I'm not a writer. And if I were, I would have come up with a better story than this. There would be breasts, and not the ones peeking at me from Lynn's flame-bedazzled bowling shirt, but beautiful breasts, teardrop-shaped with mid-sized hard nipples begging for my fingers or lips. I wonder if this is normal. This whole staring down at the end of my life as my head is suddenly filled with dancing breasts.
You saw something, didn't you?
Lynn asked as I stared in alarm. You feel like getting high and talking about it? I asked back. Lynn smiled and nodded happily.
I do indeed. I have my own strain. It's called Cuckoo. High indica. Higher THC.
I didn't know what any of that meant, so I nodded knowingly. You want to follow me? You already know my address, don't you? He looked sheepish and shrugged. Just so you know, I think that as the writer, and I could be totally wrong here, so please correct me if so, but as the writer, you should have stalkers, not be one.
I'm new to this. Give me 30 minutes. I need to grab some things.
He muttered and got into his car. I always assumed if I had someone stalk me, they'd at least have the decency to be attractive, I yelled as I pedaled off.
I get that a lot,
he yelled. I rode home with a smile. Once home, I found myself gravitate back to the upstairs window. I rolled the computer chair out into the hall and sat in the sunlight and began thumbing through Lynn's book as the birds fluttered among the branches outside. A happy little sparrow painting caught my attention, and I remembered the way the crow tore the one apart earlier and felt a chill pass through me. The sparrow has a hallowed place in history. The Egyptians believed the sparrow retrieved the soul and took it to the Duat. The English believed it to signify the death of a loved one or of the person it made eye contact with. A tapping sound caught my attention, and I looked outside curiously. The book fell from my hand as I saw a row of sparrows on the power line. Each one was staring right into the window at me. They didn't move except for swaying on the thick cable in the wind. They rose and fell, but their heads stayed trained at the window. I don't know how long we sat staring at each other.
Luke, you home?
Ling called from downstairs, startling me from my blank terror. When I jerked my head back, the sparrows took off en masse, and I slid the chair back in fright. They came swooping towards the window, and I watched them hit the glass with tiny cracks as their necks snapped and they fell to the ground below.
Holy fuck!
Lin shouted as he topped the stairs. I was so afraid I spun around and threw a solid left at him. I don't know what happened next, not exactly. I spun, screamed, and struck. Then I hit the floor with a slam that took my breath away and screamed again as my arm bent unnaturally behind me. The pain quickly abated, and I just lay there with my face against the musty carpet.
Sorry, second-degree black belt. Instinct took over.
He muttered as I moaned painfully.
Here, try this.
I smelled a potent haze of skunky pine and rolled over with a groan. He stood smiling and passed me a perfectly rolled conical joint with a line of blue smoke wafting lazily. Thank you, I think.
What the fuck was going on with the sparrows?
He asked, looking out the window at what I was sure was a disgusting pile of dead birds. I let the smoke fill my lungs as I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about them slamming into the glass pane of the window. I don't rightly have a clue. Fucking terrifying is what it was. This whole fucking place is terrifying. I was shocked to feel tears welling up. Lin took the joint and nodded as he inhaled deeply. He blew a huge cloud out and passed it back.
I imagine being so far from home is scary, especially coming from an actual city to a podunk like this.
I laughed at the word podunk. It was really an almost perfect description. I spent a couple weeks a year here my entire life. This is my grandmother's house. No, it isn't homesick. It's... fuck, I don't know how to say it. It has been weird as hell the last 24 hours or so.
How so?
He asked, exhaling a fog. I told him about the sparrow and the crow, which he found fascinating, but I found myself stopping short of mentioning the purple light and the neighbor. He seemed to sense my apprehension and politely changed the subject.
I brought something else for us. My way of apologizing for being a stalker.
And nearly breaking my arm, I muttered, rubbing my elbow. He laughed.
If I wanted to break your arm, you would get my second autograph on the cast.
We both laughed, but the unspoken acknowledgement that it was the truth passed as well. He helped me up, and we went back downstairs to where a large brown paper bag sat on the table. I grabbed the top, which was folded over and stapled, and pulled excitedly. The weed was strong enough that the horror of the sparrows was forgotten in the mouth-watering smell emanating from the bag. Inside were 4 8-inch foil-wrapped somethings, which I set on the table.
Italian beef. Hot, sweet, and wet. There's only one thing better in the entire Illinois Valley than this.
Lynn said knowingly. Sam's Pizza, I answered. He looked surprised and smiled.
I see you've been schooled already. Have you had this yet?
I shook my head, and his smile grew. I handed him one of the warm foil treats, and we sat down. Dang, that really is some good smoke. What did you call it?
Cuckoo. Glad you like it. I brought a couple of strains for you to try out.
He nodded at the food, and we tore off the foil and stared at the wonders in front of us. It was a toasted roll, split down the center and stuffed with thinly sliced meat. An assortment of peppers sat nestled in the meat, greens and reds and oranges, like an autumn scene.
Hot shot in noir, sweet peppers, and dipped in au jus. Hot, sweet, and wet. Reminds me of a couple of girls I used to know.
It is like an angel came in my mouth, was all I could think to say.
What the fuck was up with them sparrows?
He asked, as brown liquid ran down his chin. And then, the wonderful food in my mouth turned to ash. I don't know. A sparrow is partially the reason I bought your book. Everything's gotten strange since last night.
What happened last night?
He asked casually. I looked at him and debated telling the truth. I saw a purple light outside, then a pool of black that, I don't know, oozed sort of.
Into this heavy-set neighbor across the street.
Lynn finished. How in the fuck did you know that? I asked, mouth hanging open and partially chewed meat sitting stupidly on my tongue.
Where is Amethyst Lights?
Lynn asked. I didn't quite care for the note of understated panic in his voice. Upstairs. Why? He was up and running up the stairs as I asked. He was surprisingly nimble and practically leapt them.
Luke?
He called. By the window, still in the bag, I yelled back.
Was it the neighbor across the street with the blue Ford?
He called down. Probably. I don't know, cars, I replied, trying to picture the symbol I'd seen in chrome on the trunk.
He is staring at your house kinda creepily,
he said, just loud enough to carry. I got up and walked to the window and peeked out behind the curtains. He was staring at the house, like before, absent of any emotion, standing on the strip of lawn between sidewalk and actual yard. I know I was out of view, standing in the shadows at the edge of the window, but he turned his head slightly and now stared right where I stood. I walked to the front door and flipped the deadbolt slowly. The pop, as it snapped into place, seemed like a gunshot in the pregnant silence. I heard Lynn come down the steps, and I walked back to the table. My hands were shaking, and I realized my entire body had been tensed up as my fight-or-flight instincts had been screaming. What the fuck was that? I asked, and I sat down in a slump. Lynn didn't answer at first. He just thumbed through the book.
The lights were the same color as the flowers on the lilac bush when I was a child. A comforting shade that reminded me of sleep afternoons. I looked curiously to see my neighbor Frank exit his blue Ford. A mercurial pool of ebony glinted back the streetlights from the roof of the car.
What the fuck? That's not funny, I croaked. He slid the book to me, and I read a description of what I had seen. I flipped a few pages and saw where the horn alerted me before I rode in front of the blue car. I don't understand. Can you call your friend? I need answers. Lynn already had his phone to his ear. I sat, looking at the book, wanting to flip ahead, but honestly scared to death at the notion. What I didn't like then, and only truly appreciate now, is how close to the end of the book we were. I fought the urge to go forward and instead went back. It was a series of short stories that were connected by the theme of amethyst lights, it seemed, but also went in chronological order, the first taking place as Native Americans warred among each other.
No answer. He does that. Just disappears for months. He's either writing, in love, or very high on something,
Lynn said matter-of-factly. I tapped the cover of the book. So, you have read this? He nodded. To the end? I pushed. A more hesitant nod. But that would be fucking crazy to think the story was about me. A simple coincidence, right? I questioned, fearing the answer and marveling at the insanity of it all.
Probably.
He didn't seem convinced, though. Probably.
He wrote me into the story as well,
Lynn said with a shrug. Okay, I'm sure friends do that all the time. I looked warily at the book, as if it were a snake. He wouldn't look at me.
He killed me.
Funny, until it isn't, I imagine, I said dryly.
Yeah, then it becomes decidedly less funny.
He didn't look at me. I tapped the cover. Do I die as well? Lynn swiped the book from me.
It's just a book, Luke. Not even a great one. That's a lie. It's actually pretty good.
Why did he move to Texas? I asked, needing answers to the growing questions in my mind. Lynn pulled a baggie out of his cargo shorts pocket and stared intently before selecting a rather large joint and lighting it. I took it gratefully and watched him. We passed it back and forth in a silence that felt unbearably heavy. Then he spoke.
Jiry's strange, always has been. Diagnosed bipolar type 2. Crazy runs in his family. He just decided one day he was moving, no notice at all. One day he called and said he was leaving. The next day, he was gone.
A crazy rider, one that kills his friends, then runs away to Texas out of nowhere, I mused.
A lot of people have a hard time with him, and he knows it. Locks himself away because it's just as big a burden on himself. But it isn't about what he is. It's about what he knows. He does everything on instinct, makes intuitive leaps. We used to joke that he could see the future.
Lynn pushed the sandwich about, his hunger gone. My stomach lurched. I drank some water and found it sated the physical thirst, but wasn't quenching the existential one. You like whiskey? Lynn nodded and took a hit off the joint.
Jack and Coke?
I laughed. Whiskey and glass and grow some nuts. I got up and grabbed 2 tumblers and a bottle of Amber Heaven.
It was like he could see the future.
What does that mean?
He just seemed to know things. Nothing surprised him, you know? But then he started writing stories. Good ones, mind you, but weird. He would email them to me, and sure enough, a week or so later, whatever strange thing he wrote happened.
I watched as he stared off into space, remembering. I brought the glasses out and poured 3 fingers each. Why didn't he warn people? Lynn lifted the glass and took a dainty sip. His lip curled. I sadly slid a can of Coke to him.
Thank God he did, but no one ever took him seriously. And he didn't see the future, he wrote it as stories, so he didn't know until he wrote about Patrick.
I sipped the whiskey and relished the burn. What did he write? Lynn poured the Coke in, and part of me died in the exhalation of carbon dioxide bubbles.
His death. Exactly how it eventually happened. He sent it to Patrick and me. Patrick got pissed off and didn't think it was funny. None of us did. He decided to move right after the funeral. Came to it pulling the trailer. He hasn't been back since. And then he sent me a copy of Amethyst with an apology. I forgot all about it until today. It came out 3 years ago. I was shitting the brick for a while, but then, it just sort of went away. I figured I'd beat it, or whatever didn't work so far away.
He held the glass absently. Do I die? I asked, after draining the cup and refilling it with shaking hands.
"No, you don't, but I do,"
he whispered. I didn't feel the type of relief you might imagine. Something in his tone didn't sound like surviving and being okay went necessarily hand in hand. They didn't. But he tried to spare me that much, at least. Poor bastard. He tried. It was at that moment I surrendered to the inevitable. I'm sure you think I'm a coward, maybe a fool. But when you are face to face with oblivion, the only options are teeth bared or calm acceptance. I was tired. Had been for a long time. Ray Bradbury said that some people are just born sad. Try as I may to avoid it or prove it wrong, maybe I was one of those people. And the idea that this slow dirge was preordained, that I was a character in someone else's tale, that made a comforting sort of sense. "How long do we have?" I asked Lynn, who was lighting another joint.
"Not sure either of us really want to know that for sure."
He passed me the joint, which I both desperately wanted and didn't need at all. I nodded. We moved to the living room and watched a bad 80s horror movie. Unsurprisingly, Lynn knew it line for line. We laughed at the bad acting, pretending to be distracted. I never once considered reading the end of the story. Maybe I should have, but what would that really do in the long run? I simply took the next proffered joint and decided ignorance was bliss. The next morning, the pile of dead sparrows was gone from the side of the house. A pair of muddy footprints led towards the street. It didn't take Sherlock Holmes's mastery of deduction to judge the angle that seemed to lead right to the neighbor's house across the street. I had gotten up, grabbed the trash bags, and prepared myself for 20 minutes of retching. Instead, I stood in the pre-dawn watching the quiet house. It was mad, but I sure felt as if the house was watching me back. I went back inside and sat at the window upstairs, sipping coffee and watching the birds as the sun rose. When I glanced across the street, following a blue jay, I saw the neighbor staring right at me. He stood motionless as the golden light seemed to dim around him. He raised his arm slowly and put something into his mouth and chewed. Even from however many 100 feet away, I could see his mouth gaping as he chewed. My eyes threatened to explode from my skull as I saw a feather fall slowly, drifting in front of his white shirt. He was eating the fucking sparrows. Had to be. I went to the bedroom and packed up a suitcase. I grabbed the important things I thought I would need for an extended retreat and went to the garage at nearly a sprint. The door raised as slowly as in a horror film when the monster is right behind you. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him still chewing and staring as I ducked under and hit the button on the fob to unlock the doors. I popped the trunk as the garage door finally rattled home. All 4 tires were flat, the flaccid rubber shredded around the rims. I walked slowly around the car and slammed my fist on the hood, which fucking hurt, bad. I wanted to scream in rage and fear and pain, but when I looked up at the house across the street, it all froze in my throat. He stared still with those expressionless dead eyes, but then the corners of his mouth twitched into a parody of a smile. I just stared in horror as a warm trickle of piss ran down my leg. I stood in broad daylight, watching a man eat dead sparrows with an ever-growing wet spot on the front of my jeans. He just stared at me, still smiling and chewing on little hollow bones. I wondered if they crunched. I stood there in my piss-soaked pants and wondered if the little bones popped between his molars. I could practically hear them. With my bags in hand, I walked back inside, more defeated than I'd ever been in my life. I took a shower and really let it settle over my shoulders. Lynn had taken the book. There was clearly some nefarious shit happening. I was stuck with 4 shredded tires. I could get them replaced, but that meant a tow, and half the day spent at the Firestone or whatever rural equivalent existed. What would the neighbor do if I was gone all day? I knew he slashed the tires, but there was no proof. As the water dripped into the tub, I could hear the little bones crunch, see his dead eyes as they stared at me, probably right at the bathroom through the walls and half a story. Then I heard a noise downstairs. Part of me just wanted to sit down and let the water pound my skull as death climbed the stairs to take me. Just give up completely. But there was enough will buried deep down I didn't expect. I crept out of the shower, trying to not rattle the curtain as the rings slowly slid down the metal bar. It seemed too loud, carrying over the water, spraying against the bottom of the tub. I wrapped a towel around my waist, testicles fully retreated into my abdomen, and inched towards the door as I listened carefully. I looked around, frantic, seeking a weapon or anything to defend myself. A creak outside brought the dead face back, the crunching of little birds. Feathers stuck to the drool as it ran down the slack jaw. I grabbed the toilet plunger. The handle was pretty stout, solid wood, and likely to do nothing to whatever he had become since absorbing the inky goo. The handle on the bathroom door slowly began to turn, and I stepped to the side. It opened, and I swung for all I was worth, which apparently isn't much. The red rubber end hit first with a hollow, concaven thump and sprang back unexpectedly. I was in a moment of intense, fear-engaged idiocy. I tried again, and nothing changed. As I tensed up for a third strike, a hand flashed and broke the wooden handle, and the plunger head went flying.
Fucking stop! That's gross! And you hit me right in the fucking mouth!
Lynn yelled. "Why the fuck are you sneaking into my house? Especially the fucking bathroom?" I countered.
I came by to help you clean up the birds. Then I saw your tires and worried something happened to you.
I could feel my heartbeat 6 inches from my chest. You read the fucking story. You should have known what was happening.
Turns out the story wasn't finished. Or at least the ending wasn't exactly right. I talked to Gear this morning. He says hello and sorry.
Lynn said, wiping at his mouth disgustedly. I barged past Lynn, mildly grateful to have not pissed the towel. Great. The neighbor ate the sparrows while making eye contact with me. He slashed the tires, I know it. I pissed my pants, by the way. That's why I was in the shower. I pissed myself as he smiled and popped dead sparrows in his mouth. Never looked away, not once. I was at the window staring at his house, but his car was gone. I felt a momentary relief and hated myself for it. Want to go somewhere? Chicago? We can catch a show, get drunk on North Clark.
Sure, whatever. My calendar is wide open. He ate the sparrows? You sure?
Lynn asked. I nodded, still staring across the street. I saw the feathers. His eyes are dead. Dead. My mind caught up from the terror in a flash, and my eyes widened. What did Gear say, exactly?
Get dressed and I'll meet you downstairs and fill you in. I don't like a thin towel between your dick and me, especially knowing you have a sensitive bladder.
Lynn left, and I heard him go down the stairs. You watch someone eat dead birds and smile at you and see if you piss your pants. I went into the bedroom and closed the door. And you should be so fortunate to be so close to my wonderful penis.
I can safely say I wouldn't, and I was most certainly not lucky.
He yelled and laughed. I could feel something breaking inside my head. My sanity, maybe. I don't know for sure, but I know something was on the verge of collapse. Hot tears formed, and I knew if I let them go, they wouldn't stop. Once, back in Texas, I watched my buddy get a tattoo on his ribs. Anywhere directly on the bone sucks, but the ribs are among the worst, and he was hurting. Unfortunately, he had us with him watching his every flinch. I swear he had a tear form and, through will alone, sucked it back into his tear duct. I found the resolve to do the same. Lynn was rolling a joint mindlessly and humming to himself. I grabbed a glass of water and joined him at the table. There was something hypnotic in the way he broke it up and then filled the folded paper. I'd never been able to quite master that art. He looked at me and smiled before pulling a small jar from his pocket. He dribbled something that looked like honey onto the green leaves and then rolled it up and passed it to me. "What was that?" I asked as I picked it up and grabbed the lighter. It didn't matter as I inhaled.
Go juice,
was all he said as he took it and inhaled deeply. "What did Gear say?" I said, around a cloud of across smoke.
He said he never really saw an ending to the last tale, so he made one up. He is as clueless as we are,
Lynn said through gritted teeth. Sheer will kept him from coughing. "And you believed him?" I asked seriously. Lynn stared at the ceiling fan wobbling above us and sighed.
What reason did he have to lie? He never did before. If he has a problem, it's being too honest. It's off-putting, you know?
I nodded, uncertainly. I don't think he was being 100% honest. I did then because it felt nicer than the truth that screamed in the corner that I tried to stick it into. But now, as the end draws near, I think he changed the story because what really happened was worse than his version. I don't know, not for certain, but something about how it played out with this brief moment of hope told me he was sparing his friend. Sort of. As much as he could, anyway. But nothing plays out like you think it will. There's always a twist and a turn. You don't realize it until it's too late. Or, at least that was my case. We sat and talked, and soon neither of us was in any condition to go to Chicago. Instead, we went to the park. Why in the fuck would I want to go to the park? I asked, not comprehending the words in any way that made sense.
First, we didn't end the story. That means if we do, then it really doesn't mean anything. Second, it's beautiful and peaceful. Frankly, you've been through some shit, and maybe it'll help center you.
Lynn explained with a stoned rationality that seemed impossible to deny. I couldn't argue, though I petulantly wanted to. Fine. And it was. Beautiful, actually. It became our thing, as neither of us really had much of a life. Matheson, Starved Rock, and Buffalo Rock made up a triumvirate of parks in the area, and we spent the next week exploring the many trails and watching the birds. He took me to little towns, and we feasted on local fare like tenderloins the size of hubcaps and greasy burgers at dive bars. Even the creepy-ass neighbors ceased being as overtly creepy. Mostly. I would still catch him staring at me while I stared at him from the upstairs window. The police came by about my tires and said there'd been a rash of vandalizing across town, and at least 15 cars with tires slashed. They blamed it on the kids, which, when I remembered my own idiocy as a teen, seemed sort of likely. It wasn't. But who the hell believes in black ooze and lavender-colored lights? After a couple days passed, I began to question the details. It was across the street when I thought I saw him munching dead birds, and the ooze and lights never flashed or showed up again. That goddamned writer and his lies lulled me into a false sense of safety. Not that I was aware, not then, but now I see the reprieve was a fool's gambit. But we had so much fun. Maybe the ending isn't as important as the journey. That reeks of bullshit, though. We can skip most of me making googly eyes at the monster across the street and getting stoned with Lynn while watching terrible movies. We can skip that stuff because it's hard to get those frozen moments back into focus as panic has my balls fully in my abdomen. I'm not sure how much time is left to me at all, and as much fun as this stroll down memory lane has been, its ending is drawing to a close. It went to shit 2 days ago. I was at the upstairs window where I now had a canvas and easel set up as I sloppily tried to paint the birds. I was debating finger painting over whatever the hell my disconnect from brain to talent was vomiting into the world. The sky was crystal clear, and then it wasn't, that quickly. It was morning, and then it was night. I frowned in confusion. In Texas, when the sky does theatrics like this, it means hail and possibly a tornado. Everything stopped, and a sudden pressure filled my skull like when a plane's landing. I turned and ran towards the stairs, not sure which direction was safest, but anything lower seemed best. There was a sound, one I cannot describe as it's not one I've ever contemplated before. I imagine it's similar to the sound a torpedo hitting a submarine sounds like to the poor fish in the immediate vicinity. An absence so profound and low-toned, like the bass line from a sleep song, but impossibly heavier, that distorted reality around it in such a way that every window facing the street exploded inward. I fell down the stairs, lifted off my feet by the impact of God's fist onto the land, and cracked my head on the floor with a thud that rattled my brains against my skull. I pushed myself to my knees, admiring the crimson that was forming a pool on the beige threadbare carpet. I staggered over, crunching broken glass that cut through my socks and into my feet, but it felt like something happening to someone else, so I just kept moving to the door. It was still dark outside. Artificial evening at 10 in the morning, like winter at the top of the world. It didn't make sense as I tried to focus, but all I could see were spots of distortion in the air around me. I fell to my ass on the sidewalk as the pain in my shoulder and back from falling down the stairs roared to compete with the ocean in my mind of turbulent waves. I blinked away the spots and looked up at a sky of roiling black clouds and flickering lavender lights, like a swarm of fireflies everywhere around me. And then I noticed my neighbors, all of them on both sides of the street, stood staring at me with empty expressions that added a layer of permafrost to the lava inside my battered skull. They didn't seem to breathe. They just stood, unmoving, with their eyes transfixed on me as I tried to stand on my bleeding feet. The flickering amethyst seemed to avoid the eerie-as-fuck neighbors, and I hobbled around the side of the house. I patted my pocket, and of course, I didn't have my keys. I didn't expect a concussive force to launch me down the stairs, or a hail of ominous purple and a gang of zombified monsters in human flesh either. It had become a day of firsts, and continued to get worse. The tree I watched from the upstairs window was now laying through my garage and on top of the car. I wondered, if I hit the fob, would the mess underneath let out the same piteous wail that threatened to escape my chest? The same note of sustained panic that seemed to reverberate through my every cell. I threw my head back and screamed inchoately to the empty heavens above. It was a rasping, tearing, primal thing that hurt and summated the mess of emotions in my head. And then the neighbors followed suit. But where mine was the pained sound of a frightened animal, theirs was something completely alien. It didn't seem possible that a human throat could make that sustained sound, and the longer it went, the more it frayed at the edges of my sanity. I felt something drip onto my lip, rubbed absently, and stared at blood, black beneath the purple flashes and heavy black clouds. On wobbly legs, I staggered into the kitchen door, the chorus of the damned still singing in the too thick air as blood streamed into my mouth from my nose. I grabbed the phone and tried to call Lynn as the floor raced up suddenly to greet my face. In the books I'd read, this was a sign of losing consciousness. In my reality, it ended with me hitting the floor like a sack of potatoes as the screaming continued to flood through the shattered windows of my living room. Time lost all meaning as I lay, jerking in a pool of various bodily fluids, my entire nervous system overloaded by the alien sound that filled the morning of night. The purple wisps darted around my body, close enough to send tingles of cold across my skin. I felt at the edge of suffocation as my chest could only expand so far between spasms and black light swam between the amethyst, fighting for control of my vision. Then, something broke through the horrific cacophony. It wasn't much better, but it was momentarily the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I'm a cowboy, on this steel horse I ride. I gasped in huge lungfuls of air as the paralysis was broken by the 80th best music to crawl out of New Jersey blared outside. And I'm wanted, wanted, dead or alive. The strangling sound dissipated in the hair metal refrain and squawking guitars. I had never missed the sight of stonewashed denim as much as in that moment, as tears ran down my swollen cheeks and my entire body felt pricked by white-hot needles.
What the fuck happened here?
Lynn shouted from the side door.
Oh, fuck, Luke. Dude, you look like shit.
Temporarily. You're stuck with that fucking face for life. I wheezed through tears and laughter as fear and madness warred in my mind.
What happened?
I sat up painfully and told him how the sky went black and then the explosion that shattered the windows. He listened as he packed a baggie with ice and handed it to me.
Ball lightning, maybe. Or a localized tornado. Both are likely with the strange confluence of the rivers. You have any alcohol?
I pointed vaguely at the cupboard. Scotch, whiskey, maybe vodka.
Rubbing.
Upstairs, above the sink.
I saw the purple lights from outside.
He shouted as he went up the stairs. I sat silently, not willing to shout and aggravate the agonies just under the surface.
Tell me about the screams.
I don't know more. It was fucking terrifying. They just stood there at first, and then the screams began.
Do you have a gun?
Why? Because I'm from Texas? Lynn shrugged.
Yeah.
I nodded. It's in the basement, in the safe. I looked at him as he used the pair of pliers from the medicine cabinet to pull pieces of glass from the bottom of my left foot. How did you know to come over?
You called, but then I heard nothing but static. I was already headed this way.
He poured the alcohol over my torn-up soul, and I choked down a scream.
The gun is until we get the windows covered. You seem as if you'll be next to worthless on that front. Your entire body will be a bruise soon.
He wasn't lying. I could feel things seizing up from sitting on the floor. These storms happen often?
No, the last time I can think of is the weekend gear moved, the night before the funeral.
He pulled the final sliver out and began wrapping gauze around my foot. "Did you even consider leaving as well? Exploring the world and sketching new birds?" I asked, a sea of bewildered calm in an ocean of chaos.
My mom and dad are here. Everyone except for a small handful of people I've ever known live right here. No reason to leave.
Lynn inspected my right foot, but it seemed to have fared better, and he just poured alcohol and wrapped it.
Mostly scratches.
"Not even when Gear killed you in the story," I insisted. Lynn looked at me funny.
He never saw an ending, remember?
"But you didn't know that at the time."
I guess not.
He finished, got up, and grabbed the bottle of whiskey from the cupboard. I pushed myself up against my body's protestations. "I will take a double." He laughed.
You likely have a concussion, and we need to call the cops and report this.
"It's still early, and just to dull the pain." He reached into his shirt pocket and passed me a joint.
Use this instead.
"How did you die in the story?" I asked as I grabbed my lighter.
I don't remember.
"Liar, you said it freaked you out."
Years ago. I've smoked a few of those since then.
"Where is the book?" I asked as I watched him pour a tall glass of whiskey.
In the car.
He sat and took the joint and inhaled deeply.
What's the combo for the safe? I'll go down and grab the guns for you, so you don't have to attempt the stairs.
1118, then turn it to the left. Grab a box of bullets too, if you please, I said as I pushed myself up.
Where are you going?
He asked, concerned. "To piss. Watch the bottom steps, they're loose." I tested putting weight on my feet, and it hurt, but no worse than my back and head. He looked at me cautiously and then got up and went to the basement door. As soon as he headed down the steps, I hurried out to the car and grabbed the book from the glove compartment, stuck it down my pants, and went back to sit at the table.
Overcompensate much?
Lynn asked as he came back up carrying my .45. "Shit is bigger in Texas, and that includes varmints," was all I could think to say.
I'm going to run and get my plywood. You going to be okay?
He stared at me and I just nodded.
Don't sleep or drink. I'll be back in half an hour or so.
I smiled and began loading a magazine with brass. He just stared and shook his head.
Big varmints.
As soon as Bon Jovi began blaring, I pulled out the book and began reading. It was odd, reading about our trips to the various parks, and I felt my stoned and battered brain trying to tell me something, but I couldn't suss out what it was exactly. Then I got to this morning. My jaw dropped as I read about the ball lightning that burst in front of my house, and the alien cries of the neighbors. If I hadn't just lived it, I would have been filled with disbelief. Then I got to Lynn leaving for the store, and my sitting at the table reading about the day's events. Luke turned around to see Lynn staring at him from the kitchen door with regret, the amethyst lights swirling around his head. I felt a ball of ice in the back of my throat as I turned slowly to see exactly that.
Go on. Don't stop because of me,
Lynn said. Luke knew then that whatever the black ooze was, it had gotten to Lynn as well. The purple lights filled the kitchen as Luke lifted the gun and aimed it at his friend. "When?" I asked softly.
We took him this morning when we were coming to take you, but the pesky storm came.
His voice sounded normal, if flat. "What are you?"
We are the future. Your future.
He smiled, but it never reached his eyes and came towards me. I fired once, hitting him between the eyes and snapping his body backwards to smash against the stove. He pushed himself up and stared at me as black poured from the crater in his forehead. I fired 2 more times, both in the chest. The ooze gushed out of the wounds and pooled on the floor. I watched in horror as it began to undulate and move towards me. I grabbed the book and the smoldering joint and ran awkwardly up the stairs. The howls of the neighbors outside seemed lessened upstairs, and I made my way to the window and looked out to see the neighbors staring up at me. The purple lights came up the stairs and floated in the air around me, a spotlight for the dead eyes to focus on. I could hear the puddles sloshing ever nearer and pulled open the book. Luke took refuge in his room and began to recite the events that led up to this moment. The ooze grew ever closer, and he knew there was nothing to be done. Defeat weighed heavily upon my aching shoulders as I realized hope was gone at that moment. Lynn had known the entire time how it would all play out, and never said a word. Maybe he knew there was no escaping fate. I don't know, and never will. He is dead, and I can hear the ooze outside the door. According to the book, there's only one thing left for me to do. To all my loved ones and former friends, I guess this is goodbye. There isn't a way out of this. Fuck. Beware the purple lights, and that fucking gear. I'm sorry for anything I ever did, and hope you remember me fondly. Goodbye. As the door began to buckle inward, Luke grabbed the gun and placed the barrel in his mouth. With a middle finger extended to the black shape pouring through the cracks, the loud retort of the gun joined the chorus of the damned outside.
A single day added on to my prison sentence meant the difference between the normal jail and the unending nightmare of Pembina prison. I was supposed to get 364 days. That was the deal. But the judge didn't like my attitude, whatever the hell that meant. So he made it 365. Boom. 1 year was the minimum for prison. My lawyer made a stink and a half, but it didn't do any good. It's not his fault. In fact, he's the one who's going to release this statement to the press, or leak it online if the Guardian Corrections Group, GCG, tries to get an injunction on us. People have to know what happened at Pembina Prison. I'm going to put it right out there, and I'll tell you that it was haunted. You think I'm joking, nuts, or lying, but you have no idea. Haunted prisons aren't anything like you imagine. Those places that advertise themselves and give people tours are sick jokes compared to the real thing. It got so bad that you can actually look up CGC's official filings for Chapter 11. That shit put them out of business on their very first prison. And right there on the briefs, using an early statute of North Dakota law from 1857 to file an insurance claim, it says, site of Pembina Prison confirmed by Governor's Office and 2 notary publics witnessing in person to be afflicted by the supernatural such that continued business is impossible. It wasn't the first time the prison was closed for that reason either, but leeches kept buying it and reopening it, hoping to make a buck off the common man. And I was shoved into that hellhole without knowing the history even a single bit. Don't get me wrong, the building itself wasn't so bad, especially for something straight out of 1853. It was a big stone cube that was squat, heavy, and cramped, but way less sealed off than modern prisons. We could see a lot of the cells around us. There was only one main hallway per floor, and we were close enough to pass things between the bars and have some real human interaction. It could have been worse. There were 5 floors and capacity for 500 prisoners. When I first got there, I had a bunch of cellmates, and I heard that there were 2,000 guys locked up, and I believed it. But that soon changed. I didn't talk to anyone for the first 3 weeks. I'd never been to real prison before, and I was messed up over it. I didn't want to accept that I would be in that place and stuck with 3 other guys in my cell for an entire year. The whole prison seemed full of fear, man. The bottom floor would start screaming and hollering and panicking in the middle of the night all at once. We were on the top floor, but we could hear the screams echoing through that open old layout like they were right there with us. I just thought the prisoners on the bottom floor were all nuts until the guards weren't there to wake us up the first day of my 4th week. When I woke up in my corner without some asshole guard banging on the bars of the cell, I finally had to talk. I asked one of my cellmates, Dante, what was going on, and I'll never forget the fear in his voice as he said something that should have made us all incredibly happy. The guards are all gone, man. The prisoners were talking quietly between the cells and loudly between the floors through various whispers and shouts. But the most we could figure out was that something on the first floor had made them all quit and protest. Sure, must have been the crazies screaming like that during the night, right? Except none of us could get any word from the bottom floor. It was dead silent down there. The guys in the second called out for hours. Someone was down there, they said, because they could hear shuffling footsteps walking around at random every so often, but whoever it was never said a single word. That was the first time Dante mentioned the crazy stories from the first floor. He muttered that he hoped none of that was true, but when I asked about it, he just shook his head. Nothing, man. None of it ever made sense. We were a little worried as the day wore on, and no one came to let us out for breakfast, and no one came to let us out for lunch. The time we usually got to spend outside in the yard came and went, and people began getting restless. In the cell to our left, Dante's friend, Will, began telling guys to pass the word that we should all calm down and start sharing any food we had holed away. I remember asking Dante, is it really that bad? Well, they've denied meals and yard time for a day or two before, he told me. But the other 2 guys in our cells didn't look convinced. One of them said, but not like this. They made damn sure we knew what we did. They never just up and left. Someone handed us pieces of crusty old bread through the bars. It was much appreciated. The new guards didn't show up for work for another full day. We got plenty of yard time that day from these new guys, but they seemed more confused than us. We all watched from a distance as Will asked a guard about what had happened. The guard shrugged. I don't know. GCG was paying a premium for fast hires, so I signed up. What about the prisoners on the first floor? Will asked. We could still hear him shuffling around down there. We looked on the way out to the yard, but we couldn't see anybody. Huh? The guard frowned. Nobody in there. They all got transferred. Transferred? The hell's that mean? It means DOCR took them back. Returned to state custody since the company couldn't handle them. Well, that made sense. If the floor had been full of nut jobs, then North Dakota's first local private prison company hardly had the experience to handle them. But these new guys didn't even have the skills to handle us. There were half as many guards as before, and they didn't know the routines or who the dangerous ones were among us. As a result, they were distant, scared, and forceful. All except one guy, Kellen. Kellen wasn't the first guard to treat us like human beings, but by then he was the only one around. He traded jokes while in the yard, never hit us, and looked us in the eyes when he talked. He went and found some paperwork to confirm the crazies had actually been transferred. But it took 3 months to get that info out of GCG. By the time he told us he'd heard back, we'd sort of forgotten the whole thing. 2 nights later, maybe 2 hours past lights out, the guys on the second floor began screaming. Dante leapt up and fell on one of our cellmates by accident before shouting, Shit, must be a fire. And the guys in our row began banging on the bars and shouting for the guards, but the uniforms charged past and headed downstairs without talking to us. We could hear them shouting orders down below and then yelling in confusion. The prisoners' screams were clear, coming from the second, and it sounded like they were terrified of something in particular and wanted help. The sounds of gates being slammed and people running reached us after about 10 minutes shouting, and then it was silent, and we sat in the dark waiting and listening until morning. When the new shift came in, they were surprised and confused, and Kellen came by to ask us what had happened. We told him what we knew, but he'd shown up and found open gates and an empty second floor. There was no indication what had happened, but he promised to check with corporate and figure out if the absent prisoners had all been rapidly transferred again. Dante gripped the bars and made sure Kellen was looking at him. Please find out who the hell is walking around there at night. Kellen blinked at that. I'm day shift, so I don't know what I can do, but what do you mean? The prisoners are gone, Dante told him, fiercely but quietly. But the guys on the third floor said they still hear someone, maybe 2 or 3 someones, shuffling their feet every hour or so till morning. I guess I could go look right now. Dante reached for the bars and grabbed his uniform, something which usually got us a beating. Hear me. Do not go in there by yourself. Stay in the stairwell unless someone's with you. Kellen nodded fearfully. It looked like he finally understood how spooked we were. He waved another guard off, and Dante let go. But nothing more came of it for a whole season. The night shift had quit, and more guards got hired at an even higher pay. Kellen and another uniform scooped out the first 2 floors, but they found nothing. Dante thought it was because they were looking during the day, but he wasn't about to ask our only friend to risk himself. It was maybe 3 months later. Yeah, I was halfway through my sentence, and I had taken up drawing, so I had a pen and paper, when we woke up in the middle of the night to everyone on the 3rd floor screaming in absolute panic. This time we were less scared during the event itself. Will offered a guard racing past $500 from his commissary account if the man would come back and tell them what was going on. Dante listened intently, trying to hear individual screams from the 3rd floor over everyone else's shouting and confusion. I wrote down any words he thought he heard. What I wrote down: Jesus Christ! Killing him! God! Let us out! Coming this way! We weren't as scared when it was happening because we'd lived through it twice before, but this time the long-term fear was much deeper. Now we knew for sure what was going to happen again, and any prisoners that had the means began lawyering up and doing everything they could to transfer to other prisons, even if it meant worse conditions. The problem was the North Dakota prison system was already overflowing, which was the whole reason GCG got started in the first place. So every guy that got out meant it was that much harder for the rest of us. Both of our cellmates transferred, giving us motor space, so that was nice. But it was small consolation. Apparently word had started to spread outside, and GCG's solution, instead of paying the guards even more, was to stop having the night shift at all except for just one poor guy. Kellen was a bit miffed he hadn't gotten a raise out of the whole thing, but he was starting to believe us that something was going on. By then, he'd been around a while and he knew we weren't bullshitters. And too many other prisoners had told him they'd heard someone walking around the first, second, and third floors at random during the night. It was just a few steps, sometimes as many as 20, but it only happened every so often, and only once it had been long enough that you'd thought it had stopped for good. One guy on the 4th floor said he heard a full run from one end of the 3rd floor hallway to the other, clear enough that he'd expected the guard to come charging up the stairwell, but nobody had appeared. He slit his wrists and got transferred out on a medical leave the next day, so we took him serious. All that was enough to get Kellen to start doing some research on the outside. He came to us in the 7th month of my sentence with a pale face. Beside us at the bars, Will asked, "What's the word?" Kellen seemed grim. "A lot of bullshit out there, but this place is mentioned a lot. It's been closed before, but I keep getting stonewalled when I ask for the historical documents. Thing is, I don't think the prison itself is the problem. Get this." He pulled out a notepad for reference. 2 Canadian priests, Fathers Norbert Provencher and Sévère Dumoulin, visited Pembina in 1818, before it was even an official township. That was when the Hudson Bay Company was big around these parts. That's how long ago it was. Pembina was the biggest town in North Dakota then, so the trading post was full, and the priests chose to sleep outside by where the Pembina River meets the Red River. The folk tale has it that a vision of a rotting woman came in the night and stole Provencher's life. The 2 men bartered with her to split the remaining life between them, consigning both to live only 35 more years instead of 70 Sévère had left. Sévère got an extra month and 20 days as a gift from his friend for his sacrifice. He paused, as if we might guess the obvious outcome. They both died 35 years later. I knew Pembina Prison had a horrible problem, but that didn't mean I had to believe everything. Let me guess. A month and 20 days apart? Kellen nodded. Dante snorted. "It's true, dude," Kellen insisted. "The dates of death are right there on Wikipedia, but get this. 35 years after 1818 made their death year 1853, the year this prison was built. And the place they camped that night? By the meeting of the rivers?" I didn't know what it meant, but I was beginning to feel very uneasy. "It's right here, isn't it?" He was dead serious. "I think there's some shit here, ancient shit. I asked a guy I know, he's got Chippewa relatives, over at Turtle Mountain. They know the history of the Red River better than anyone else. He said his uncle told him to never sleep at the meeting of the Red River and the Pembina River. He said something lives there under the ground and awakens with the changing of the seasons." We were silent for a beat after that. It was folktale nonsense, but it was as good a theory as any. Whatever it was going to come back, and it wasn't friendly. Will talked to Kellen for another few minutes, but Dante was silent. After he was gone, I asked him, "What's wrong?" He sat on one of the now unused bunks and told me, "I got another 5 years in here, and I ain't got no money for a lawyer. Your sentence will be up before it reaches us, and I'll be here alone." "Will it?" There was no way to be sure. "I'll be back in 2 months for the 4th floor, and then 3 months after that for us. I could get out a week before or a day too late. It doesn't seem to be exact." He just looked at the floor. "What I mean is, I do hope you get out before it comes." Oh. I wasn't sure what else to say after that, so I just sat in my corner, like I always did. It wasn't too much after that we heard GCG was going under. The mad rush of transfers had pissed off the state and lost the company a vital contract for a second location, and investors had pulled out or something. The number of guards was cut, then slashed, and Kellen took a pay hit to stay on as the only guy on the day shift. There's only 2 prisoners left on the 4th floor, he told the 20 of us remaining, as the general week we expected it to happen approached. I feel like I should stay late just to see what the hell's going on down there. But the former guards I asked about it are all terrified as hell and refused to talk. Some got violent just because I asked. It's cool, Will told him. You got a kid at home. Don't be here for it. The 20 of us left on the 5th floor, sat in our cells once night fell, praying and listening. On Monday night, nothing happened. The 2 guys down below occasionally shouted up to us that everything was clear. On Tuesday night, nothing happened. The strain was growing, though, and we could hear hear him breathing rapidly down there. I could only imagine the adrenaline rushing through them every minute until dawn. On Wednesday night, nothing happened. Yet something had changed in the air. The prison was much quieter now than 2,000 men had become 22, and I thought I could feel a subtle sort of heartbeat in the air, pounding against reality like it was a thin sheet of paper. It's just your imagination, Dante whispered. None of us were willing to speak louder than that. On Thursday night, the heartbeat became a feeling of footsteps approaching from a great distance. Guys! Will shouted from his cell. You good down there? Still here, one responded from down below. But I can feel it. It's at the door. It's knocking. What the hell's that supposed to mean? But the man below did not respond. Friday night. That was the night it would happen. All day the 2 guys on 4th pulled and clanged on their bars, begging to be let out. Kellen was torn. After 2 hours of listening to that pleading, he came up with an idea and transferred both of them up to our floor. If nobody's on 4, he said happily, then we'll all be safe, right? Out loud we agreed, but we were kidding ourselves. When the night guard showed up, he freaked and took the 2 men back down. He said out loud what we were all thinking. If nobody's on 4, then it'll just come right to 5 and get us all. What the hell was Kellen thinking? We had to listen to hours of sobbing that evening. It was the hardest trial of my life. I wanted to call out to the night guard. I wanted to ask him to get those men out of there. But if I did, I knew whatever was coming would find all of us instead. The moment it happened was like a cold hand on my shoulder. What's going on down there? Dante shouted. The man, who was not sobbing, called back, It's changing. Will demanded, What's happening? Tell us. It's red. Red? It's red. What's red? Will yelled insistently. God damn it, what's red? We stared down the hallway at the night guard, who stood listening with fear. The screaming began a few seconds later, this time only 1 floor below. We could clearly hear every word. The sobbing prisoner shrieked, There! It's there! The man who'd been communicating with us began incoherently, raging with fear against his bars. Then, strangely, he stopped. The 20 of us clung to our bars, unable to help, unable to flee. Many of us cried, but we were otherwise silent, for to yell would be to drown out the last words of the men below. But they were eerily quiet for nearly 2 hours. We waited in strained silence as random footsteps traversed the 4th floor every so often. What was happening? For the first time, the victims of whatever was going on down below had chosen to be quiet instead of yelling for help. Why would that make things different? At long last, the sobbing man broke the silence. Oh my God, it's coming your way. Shut up. It'll see you. Distracted. Hit your bars. The sound of clanging echoed up the stairwell. The sobbing man said with terror, It knows. It knows. Jesus Christ, do something. We were no longer silent. We echoed that sentiment loudly and repeatedly to the guard. Do something. He just stood there, literally quaking in his boots. Will screamed at him, Snap out of it! The other guards and prisoners got away. You can too. Whatever it is, it won't follow you if you let them out and leave. I shouted, They're gonna die down there! Dante threw his shoe, and the impact finally snapped the man out of his terror. The guard ran to the stairwell and descended. The first thing we heard him say was taken aback. Mary, Mother of Christ. The sobbing man again. Over here! For God's sakes, let us out! The other prisoner wasn't talking for some reason. We could hear his terror, gasping, but that too went quiet. Then we heard a buzzer, and all the gates on 4 slammed loudly open. The sounds of panting, running, and someone dragging something followed. The prison went silent. And just like that, we were alone again. The formerly crowded prison now felt terrifyingly large and empty, with only 20 of us and no guards. That night, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from down below. I counted time as best I could. 40 minutes. Then someone took 3 steps out of his cell and into the hallway. An hour and 6 minutes. Someone ran 10 steps along the hallway and stopped abruptly. 28 minutes. The footsteps approached the stairwell, but then turned into a cell and went silent. Thing was, whoever it was sounded barefoot, and the starting and stopping locations did not match. Where they ended was often nowhere near where they began again later. By the time dawn came, we were scared into motionless, terrified silence, and it took Helen's arrival for us to begin stirring again. With GCG in bankruptcy court, we no longer had a night guard at all. If it came for us, there'd be nobody to let us out of our cells, like everyone else. We hardly talked. We hardly ate. Each passing day was a grain of sand falling through an hourglass, marking our executions. Our fellows began confessing to crimes they hadn't even committed just to get transferred to Supermax out of state, the only option left. Well, that and suicide attempts. One by one, Kellen escorted or dragged out guys out of our floor. 20 became 15, then 10. Then it was just me and Dante, with Will still in the cell to our left. The 3 of us and Kellen, 4 men waiting for doom. We sat playing card games in the weeks leading up to it. It would be 1 full year for me in that place, but I could swear I'd spent a lifetime in that cell. I couldn't think, couldn't remember life before, couldn't imagine surviving after. Every day I prayed for a transfer to come in, but North Dakota got sick of our shit, and the judges had stopped hearing cases from Pembina Prison. They didn't know there were only 3 of us left. Nobody knew. We contacted the media. We phoned the governor's office. We made a ruckus. That was worse than nobody knowing. It turned out nobody cared. 2, there was nobody higher up at GCG following the situation, and Kellen couldn't get anybody on the phone. Payroll, meaning just his paycheck, was being handled by a third-party disbursement company that couldn't answer questions about ongoing proceedings. The week approached. On Monday night, nothing happened. We were like statues in our cells, alone, waiting for a sign of the executioner's approach. When dawn came, we sighed and began moving again. Dante asked, "You get out Friday?" I nodded. If things went like before, I'd be released the day of. As long as I left before sundown, I'd be all right. On Tuesday night, nothing happened. 2 for 2. Just one more day. I sat through that darkness until... No. The feeling of the prison had changed around us. A subtle heartbeat seemed to pulse against our faces and ears and eyes. It had come a day earlier in the week than the last time. That morning, Will patted my arm as we both leaned out the bars. Sorry, man. Dante just shook his head angrily. I wasn't going to get out in time. On Wednesday night, the heartbeat became the sound of footsteps approaching from some unfathomable distance. I think I stood at the bars of our cell that entire day, fingers wrapped around the metal with force to match the tension in the air and in our minds. This couldn't happen. This wouldn't happen. My lawyer would walk in and tell me he'd gotten the judge's unfair addition of an extra day removed. One day. One goddamn day. Even if I'd spent the whole year in this prison, one day still meant life or death. Let me out! Let me the hell out, for God's sake! But nobody cared, and nobody'd listen. I'd like to tell you that Kellen stayed late that night. I'd like to tell you that when the entire floor began to glow red, the hallway, the cells, the stone itself, as whatever ungodly abomination, in the earth began to wake up upon the changing of the season, as distant footsteps became a traveler at the door of our minds, I'd like to tell you that Kellen was there and hit the button and opened the gates and let us all out. I'd like to tell you that I didn't see anything, and that I'm not permanently a broken man. I didn't claw at the walls of my cell as it approached slowly, moving a few steps every 20 to 70 minutes. I'd like to tell you that all three of us were able to run away and escape that horror upon reality, with its rotting hands and blind eyes radiating crimson light as it searched for us at random. But I can't give you a satisfying end to this story. The disbursement company fired Kellen and changed the locks in the property. According to their paperwork, all the prisoners had been moved, and they thought he'd been getting paid for guarding an empty prison. They left us in there for 11 days before the error was found, which meant 11 nights with that thing. For 11 days we starved. For 11 nights we sat absolutely still, not daring to move or breathe or even look left or right. It knew where we were, generally. It stood right outside our cell for hours, and sometimes walked right through the bars and grasped at the beds around us, daring us to make even the slightest motion. When you've spent 6 hours staring into the blind crimson eyes of a rotting demon, unable to blink your eyes for fear it will hear the air your lashes move, when you've seen what it's seen, the worlds it's walked, reflected in hellish red, you'll understand. No one cares. I'd like to tell you that Kellen actually existed. I'd like to tell you we had a friend among the guards, and that it wasn't all that bad. I'd like to tell you I wasn't traumatized by the hell I went through being left to rot and left to die as nothing more than a number on some corporation's books. But no one cares.
I never knew Grandpa Kenny and Grandma Lita. My mama left home before I was even born. She kept her people in the rearview mirror and had left no forwarding address. Mama's people were the folks at Miller's Hollow, never ever Mom and Dad. Everything would have been different if it hadn't been for Grandma Lita's cousin Gavin. Might have been real different for the folks at Miller's Hollow, the people I'd never know. But I wanted to know them, who they'd been, what they were like. They were family. All my friends had grandpas and grandmas. Dad's parents died young, and I never knew them either. I was missing out by never knowing the family, and maybe some aunts and uncles and cousins along the way. I just knew it. Ever since I was little, I've been nagging my daddy for stories about this missing in action family. Mama just got mad, so I stopped asking her. We didn't even have a single snapshot of any of them, and that was just plain weird, the way I saw it. One night, just a few days past my 16th birthday, Mama ran into the house from the car crying, leaving groceries strewn all over the front lawn. She had gone straight to her room and locked the door. Daddy ran outside but came back in after just a couple minutes and locked the front door, and he told me to go to my room and do the same. A couple hours later, Daddy knocked on my door. He told me it was time for me to hear the story I've been dying to hear. The story of Grandpa Kenny and Grandma Lita, and the story of Cousin Gavin. Mostly, though, he said it was the story of Gavin and the Stumpwater moonshine, and how it changed everything in Miller's Hollow back in 1973, and pretty much everything thereafter. Life had been like it always was in the Hollow, back before the doings of the summer of '73. My mama's Mama Lita and her parents lived like everybody else around there. She was in their freshman year at Lakefield High School, and her mama worked at Bev's Quick Mart. Like most of the men in the Hollow, her daddy worked at Prescott Mines like his daddy did before him. That year, 1973, the big statewide budget cuts shut down the East Fulton Psychiatric Hospital. That's when Lita's cousin Gavin came to live with them. He'd been a guest at the East Fulton ever since his parents died in a car wreck some years before. Lita's Aunt Lou and Uncle Frank had kept their strange boy at home, under lock and key, so to speak. Gavin had been what they call a miracle child. Whispers were among the old folks that Uncle Frank had come back from the war somewhere, hurt real bad in his parts, and so he'd never be able to make a child with Aunt Lou. Of course, there were more whispers about maybe Lou had flown the coop one night and gotten up to some mischief somewhere. But she had always sworn it was a lie, and that she had never laid with no man but her Frankie, saying the Lord Almighty had blessed him, and that was the end of it. Except those stories about that night, that there was lightning and a howling, screaming storm like nobody remembered, and then Lou'd been found out in the woods. That's all I ever heard. I always believed Lou's story, though, especially as I got to hear Cousin Gavin's history. Gavin had never really been right for school, and he had never spoken a single word since the day he was born. It wasn't like he was violent or anything. Not really. He just didn't know how things worked, and that small things were fragile, especially living things. Lou and Frank never kept pets, and any strays were always run off before Gavin had a chance to accidentally do any harm. When he was just 14 years old, the same age as Lita herself, Gavin's parents had died in an accident when their car went off the Hattie's Point Bridge into the river during flood season. Lita wrote in her diary how she had a secret that made her cry herself to sleep every night. She hadn't even told Sally Comstock when she came over to interview the family for a few kind words about the deceased for the church page of the Sunday paper. What Lita hadn't wanted anyone to know was what she had heard her Uncle Frank swear he was going to do. He said he was going to run their car off Hattie's Point into the water with him and Lou and Gavin in it to save everybody in the Hollow from what was sure to come, having the boy underfoot and hanging around normal people. Frank had spat on the floor and slammed his fist on the table, even though he was talking about his own son, and Aunt Lou had started bawling. When Lou and Frank finally did go off the bridge into the water, Gavin had been in the car too, of course. Everybody said it was a true miracle of the Lord God Almighty that the boy survived, and how happy Lita must be to have her own dear cousin home safe with her and her family. This strange silent boy who never said a word, but who had a liking for doing things that set other people on edge. Like the way he'd touch himself down there and start grunting and drooling and bouncing up and down. Whenever he'd start in on that, Lita's mama would lock him in his room and only let him out the next morning. She also kept him locked in his room while the rest of them were at work and school. Lita's father put bars on Gavin's windows so he couldn't get out, and locked him in at night so they didn't have to listen to him rooting around the house when they couldn't keep an eye on him. Things went on like this for a few months before Lita's daddy packed up and cleared out after work one day. He just couldn't handle it anymore, but he wasn't man enough to stick around and help his wife and daughter with the burden. Within a month, Lita's mama hung herself from the oak tree in the backyard with a clothesline. Lita was almost past her wits' end when things slid even farther into the red zone. Not a month after her mother's funeral, there was a horrible storm of mythic proportions. Lightning and thunder slammed the hollow for 3 days, while the winds and rain tore up the trees and even blew out a couple of Lita's windows. She had listened to Gavin wailing half the night, and then somewhere around dawn, he had finally settled down. Lita fell asleep for a while, and when she woke up, the storm had broken. She made some breakfast for the two of them, and she found the boy's room empty and the door frame busted out and splinters all over the floor. Lita searched everywhere but couldn't find no sign of her cousin. She had begun to scour the woods up the hill in the back of the house when she came upon a tree stump burned off by the lightning, still smoking and full of rainwater. There was Gavin, half naked and shoving handfuls of muck and leaves into the stump and stirring it with a burnt twig. Grabbing hold of him, Lita looked into the stump and saw leaves and mushrooms floating, a bunch of slugs bobbing on the surface, and the half-eaten body of a raven submerged in the bloody water. Recoiling when she saw the slugs on his arms, she almost puked when he pulled the icky things off his skin and sat there grinning and hooting and stuffing them into his mouth. Then he ripped himself free of her grasp and started churning up that mess in the stump again. Lita managed to get Gavin back to the house, but there was no point in putting him in his room with the door frame busted out, so she locked him in the cellar. Then she got dressed and headed off to school. When she got home, she was mortified to find Gavin had busted through the cellar door and was long gone. She went right back up the hill to where she knew she'd find him. There he was, sitting beside that stump again, this time sucking water and God knows what else out of a hole on the side of the thing. There were more toadstools floating in the mess, along with some flowers and beetles, and a clogged knot of something she couldn't quite make out, and decided she didn't want to. Gavin was just sitting there grinning and rolling his eyes like a drunkard. She managed to stumble him back to the house, got him fed and washed up, and then barricaded in the bathroom. Lita sat on the back porch and started crying. She just didn't know what to do with the boy. He was family. She was not going to turn him into wherever they put people like him. Besides, those places were all shut down now, so she couldn't, even if she wanted to. He was big now, and taller than her too. And even though they had always said he was harmless, it would never hurt anybody, Lita was shit scared of him. Probably it was because he never talked, and she had no idea what was going on inside of him. The next night when Lita got home from school, Gavin had broken free again. She found him back up on the hill, rolling in the grass, drunk as a skunk on whatever crazy mash he had cooked up in that lightning stump still of his. But he seemed happy, and he didn't put up a fuss when she herded him back to the house. The next morning she locked him in the bathroom again, but not before tying him down. When she got back that afternoon, she wasn't that surprised to find he had got out again. She had found him back up at that stump water still of his. But this time Lita gasped in shock. In Gavin's arms was a baby, the neighbor's child, little Katie Fargo. What gave Lita the chills was the way he was sucking on the baby's fingers like they were teats, with his eyes closed and a creepy cooing, gurgling sound coming out his mouth. Katie Fargo was giggling and kicking her little legs with delight, even though Gavin had poured that mucky crap water all over her pudgy little body. He didn't resist when Lita pulled the child out of his arms and ran off with her toward the Fargo place. Eddie Fargo was on the phone to the deputy when she arrived, and his wife Shauna was in screaming hysterics. Lita said she had found the child crawling near their woodpile. Then she had hurried on out of there before they had time to think to ask any questions. She found Gavin still sitting beside the stump, sucking that yucky water out of a hole on the side of the blackened stump. He was picking slugs and leeches off himself, popping them with his teeth like chocolate cherries, the sticky blood streaming red from his lips and dripping off his chin. Lita vowed that tomorrow, as soon as she got home from school, she was going straight over to Erickson's Hardware for a good long length of case-hardened steel chain and a dog collar with a lock on it. That was the best she could come up with in the way of a plan for now. The next morning, Lita brought Gavin his breakfast. Before she even opened the door to the bathroom, she paused and listened. The boy was singing. It was a high-pitched melodic tune that was just the most god-awful thing she had ever heard. Gavin, who had never spoken a single word in his whole life, was singing. She couldn't make out any of the words, so she eased open the door and peered in. He was lying in the bathtub with his head on the pillow she had brought in for him. Just lying there, one leg crossed over the other, singing and waving his right hand in the air like he was leading an orchestra. Lita smiled, part happy but mostly sad through her tears. She went in and set his plate where he could reach it, and then she went out and closed the door as Gavin resumed his aria. When she got home that afternoon, she didn't even bother going into the house. She knew Gavin wasn't going to be there. Sure enough, making her way through the trees, she heard this happy voice singing his strange song. But she stopped short and groaned when she saw him sitting there with Katie Fargo on his lap again. She started toward them, scolding the boy. Then she heard the screaming. It was coming from Katie and her mama Shauna, and was echoed by roars of animal rage from the baby's father as he barreled through the trees toward them. Lita stopped in her tracks before stumbling forward and muttering an incoherent sob. Shauna stood not 5 feet from Gavin and her child, vomiting. There were leeches on Katie's arms and face and on her fat little legs, and Gavin was pulling them off and plopping them into his mouth with a loud sucking sound. Then Lita saw all the blood on Katie's arms and legs and face, and the other plump red morsels Gavin was shoving into his grinning mouth as he chewed and tried to keep on with his singing. Katie had stopped screaming. She was long past that now. Lita watched in horror as Gavin shoved the baby off his lap and into the mud, where she just laid there, her neck twisted at a sickening angle. Lita saw a lot more blood when Eddie Fargo raised his shotgun and emptied both barrels into her cousin's shoulder. The blast knocked Gavin backwards at least 5 feet into the mud. Then Lita passed out and knew no more for a good long while. When she came to, she was in the hospital. In the bed next to her was Gavin, hooked up to a bunch of wires and tubes and machines like some kind of Frankenstein. A few minutes later, the police came to talk to her. Preliminary questions about whether she had been actively involved in the incident, as they called it, or not. Lita knew better. What she had witnessed wasn't any incident. It was a murder. The brutal butchering of an innocent child. A baby not 6 months old by a monster who was of her own flesh and blood kin.
"Why didn't you drown instead of Aunt Lou and Uncle Frank?"
she growled, looking at him lying there, trussed up on life support.
"Why didn't Eddie's bullet finish you off, you freak?"
she screamed through her choked sobs. Then he stirred in his sleep and started in on that infernal singing that made no sense, but now made Lita's flesh crawl. She had to put down the urge to get out of bed and go smother him with his pillow and put an end to his vile existence. After that, things happened pretty quickly. There was the trial, a hideous nightmare of a trial that was hustled through the system just weeks after Gavin had been declared fit to stand before the court. There were all the to-be-expected testimonies from the Fargos on how they had found their baby Katie in the clutches of this half-wit neighbor, murdered and worse before their very eyes. There'd been the testimony by the police and first responders on the scene. None of that had prepared Lita for the blown-up pictures in full color of the victim, of Katie Fargo's tiny body, half-eaten and covered in leaves and blood. Then there was the other picture, the one taken after Lita was taken away in the ambulance. There was Gavin sitting in the mud, grinning and bleeding from the gunshot wound in his shoulder, and vomiting blood in great red gushes down the front of his shirt, and trying to shove it back into his mouth with his fingers. Lita had gagged at the sight, and the court matron half carried her to the bathroom where she puked her guts out. Then Lita collapsed on the floor and ended up back in the hospital. They'd spared her any further exposure to the public and the press. The trial ended the way murder trials usually do in a county where people believe evil is a man's willful misdoing, and put little stock in reasons of insanity and diminished capacity. As expected, the public defender for Gavin rambled through a litany of predictable excuses like the boy's state of mind and the startling change that had come over him after the big lightning storm, and how he probably had some lingering effects from mushrooms or leeches and beetles and whatever else he was sucking out of that stump water still of his. None of that mattered to anybody in the vicinity of Miller's Hollow, least of all to Eddie and Shauna Fargo, and to Lita. Gavin was condemned and sentenced to hang for his crimes, and given a reduced sentence aforehand, meaning they had fast-tracked him to meet the gallows without a lengthy stay in jail at the county taxpayers' expense. On the morning of August 15, 1973, Gavin Wendover Wilcox took his last meal of eggs, ham, toast, and black coffee, and then went without benefit of counsel or clergy to meet his maker without a word besides the song he had been singing since the storm. Three days later, Lita Earline Wilcox and that handsome boyfriend of hers, Kenny Orton, set off for parts unknown and undeclared, leaving the house in Miller's Hollow and all that was inside it for anybody who wanted it. Lita and Kenny got married somewhere along the way, and before too much time had passed, they'd welcomed my mama into the world. Lita never forgot the events of the summer of '73, of course, but she had made her peace with the past as best she could and found some happiness in her husband and her new baby girl, Nora, my mama. One night when Nora was about a year old, Lita was driving home with a load of groceries when a man stepped off the curb right in front of her. She'd slammed on her brakes and missed hitting him by inches. The man had turned around and grinned at her, and then he had run off. Lita could have sworn it was Gavin, which was strictly speaking not even possible since he was long dead and buried in the ground. She pulled over to the curb and just sat there, shaking and telling herself she was seeing things. When she got home, she did her best to put the whole thing out of her mind and started to fix dinner. Kenny walked in the door a few minutes later, pleased as a pickle, and told Lita he had gotten a raise. That was the end of any thoughts of Lita's past. The next morning, Lita woke up to the sound of Nora laughing and giggling in her crib. She went into the baby's room expecting to see Kenny playing with her as he always did each morning before work, but it was late and he was already gone. Lita changed her daughter's diaper and went to get her bottle. When she came back, she heard Nora singing. Lita almost gagged when she made out a few notes of what sounded like that craziness Gavin used to sing during his final days leading up to the incident. Lita shook her head, thinking she was imagining things again, as she scooped little Nora up in her arms, and she was just jabbering her happy baby sounds. No singing, nothing to worry about. Besides, Gavin was rotted in the dirt. She knew that for a fact. The next day when Kenny got home, he was in a terrible mood. He ate dinner without saying more than a few words, and then retired to the TV with a beer. Lita went and curled up next to him after she had put the baby down for the night, but he wouldn't say what was bothering him. Long after they went to bed, Lita lay awake, knowing something was wrong with her man, knowing he lay there in the darkness next to her with his eyes open and staring at the ceiling. She got up later to get the baby's bottle when she heard her fussing. When she came back to bed, Kenny turned on the light and looked at her.
What?
She asked. You notice anybody hanging around outside today? He asked in that low mumble he used when he was grappling with something uneasy.
No. Did you?
She hissed.
Yeah. Some creeper in the bushes between the houses. But
he had broken off with a shrug and a wince and just shook his head.
But what?
Lita cried.
Kenny, you're scaring me.
Her husband asked her if she was sure she hadn't seen anybody. She hadn't. Then she remembered the man who stepped out in front of her, and she went all cold inside.
The crazy thing is,
Kenny had continued,
he looked just like Gavin. Exactly like he did before before they hanged him. Looked exactly like him, Lita. You sure? Sure as shit that evil fucker's dead?
Lita cried out and buried her tears in her husband's shoulder and told him about the man she had seen in the road. The next day, Lita called the courthouse in Miller's Hollow.
Yes, Gavin Wilcox was hung by the neck until dead,
the voice in the hollow said.
He was pronounced on August 15, 1973 at 7:13 a.m. by Dr. Jason Matthew Higgs of the county coroner's office. He was removed to Johnson's funeral home where he was prepared at minimal expense and procedure for the burial he duly received at Sacred Heart Cemetery on August 17, 1973 at 11 a.m. before no witnesses besides staff and employees of Sacred Heart and the previously mentioned Dr. Higgs.
The woman droned on robotically.
No mistakes or errors possible in the public record. The deceased in question was surely and for all time dead and interred, never again to rise,
the woman assured her, and then hung up without a goodbye or an anything else I can do for you today, ma'am. None of this did anything to ease Kenny and Lita's sense of dread when they saw the pure evil likeness of Lita's dead cousin, Gavin Wilcox, standing outside the church the following Sunday where they had gone just to be on the comfortable side of damnation. Of course, the likeness had disappeared when Kenny had taken off after him, just like he had disappeared when Lita found him looking in the kitchen window after breakfast the next morning. No amount of assurances by the woman in Miller's Hollow could dispel the shock and disgust Kenny and Lita felt when they picked the baby up from her crib that night and found her blanket soaking wet and sticky with the stinking reek of mushrooms, rotted leaves, and foul water. It was decided then and there that raise or no raise, unholy apparition or crazy stalker, Kenny and Lita were pulling up stakes and moving far away. They jumped 5 states in as many days and sat down in Wichita, Kansas. When Nora was about 2, Lita heard her daughter singing a tune that set her blood to ice. When she had asked her daughter where she had heard the tune, she said, "The Man in the TV." Lita had breathed a sigh of relief. The next day, she was carrying her daughter to the car when Nora started laughing and singing that bone-chilling tune again and yelling, "Look, Mommy, look, the man in the TV." Lita turned just in time to see the doppelganger of Gavin Wilcox riding past him on an old rusted bicycle. The man grinned and waved, and Lita ran with her daughter in her arms to the car and drove straight to Kenny's work. The next day they packed up and pulled out for California. They had been there a little over a year when Nora started talking about her invisible friend, a man who never said a word but sang her a song over and over. The man had tried to get Nora to drink from an old wooden bucket he carried, but it smelled bad and had bugs floating in it, so she had refused. Lita and Kenny were horrified. They asked their daughter where she had met this man. In the backyard, the girl had said, and at school, and late one night in her bedroom, and even in the bathroom where he had put yucky things in her bathwater. Lita and Kenny packed up and moved again and again and again. Whenever the singing Gavin man or the apparition of him appeared, they moved frequently all through Mama's childhood and teenage years. Whenever the singing Gavin man appeared in Nora's room at night, or taunted Kenny and Lita on the streets, from windows, near their house, and from passing buses and cars and trucks. Always with that maddening grin and that incessant, horrible, mindless singing. When Nora left for college, the visitation stopped completely. No more sightings, no Gavin showing up in the middle of the night in her room, no trying to force her to drink from his bucket that stank of rotted growing things. It was the end of it. Lita and Kenny moved back to Miller's Hollow to make their peace, or some such unfathomable reason, and Mom cut ties with her parents because of it and put it all behind her, as Lita herself had done before her. Mama finished college and got a good job. Then came a series of promotions, a few boyfriends, and then the man who would become my father came on the scene and wiped the floor with the competition and swept Mama off her feet. In the fullness of time, I joined the clan. When I was old enough to start wondering, I started asking about Mama's people. I wanted to know why I didn't have a grandpa and grandma from the Wilcox side of the family, but no one would ever say a word about them. On that night when Mama had run into the house all tears and hysterics, Daddy decided it was time for me to hear the story. When he was finished, I just sat there thinking, trying to process it all.
"Thanks for telling me, Dad, I
I said, wrapping my arms around myself the way I do when it's cold or I'm figuring things out.
So I guess you thought I was finally grown up enough to handle it?
I asked, sitting up straight and looking at him in case there might be more to be told.
Yes, that of course, buddy. But also because when I got up to go to the bathroom last night, I could have sworn I heard Gavin's song coming out of your room. But then it all stopped of a sudden and I heard you powering down your computer. So I figured it was just some of that weird music of yours. Yeah, whatever,
I said, nodding and smiling at him.
Right,
Father continued.
But then tonight, what set your mother off was she saw somebody looking in the window. When I went outside, I just couldn't believe it. It was him. It was Gavin. I switched on the porch light, but he was gone. But it was him.
As we sat there, lost in thought, Mom appeared in my doorway, her eyes wild and her hand over her mouth.
He's out there?
She hissed, just staring at my dad and me, and glancing nervously at the window.
It's okay, Mom. I know all about it,
I said, trying to seem all grown up and everything. My parents went on to bed, but I knew they weren't sleeping. In my own room, I killed the light, lit some candles, and just sat there in the cool darkness of my sanctuary. I had plenty of ideas about how to make Cousin Gavin go away forever. Tugging at the small inverted pentagram at my throat, I carefully went over in my mind which of my friends I knew to have the stomach for the kinds of things I'd been thinking about lately. Things I wanted very badly to try on somebody. Something just like dear, sweet Cousin Gavin.
Chilling tales for dark nights.